CHAPTER V of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part II, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman. Part II, Samuel Champlain and His Associates. Chapter V, The Jesuits and Their Patroness, 1610 to 1611. Poutrincourt, we have seen, owned Port Royal in virtue of a grant from De Monts. The ardent and adventurous baron was in evil case, involved in litigation and low in purse, but nothing could damp his zeal. Acadia must become a New France, and he, Poutrincourt, must be its father. He gained from the king a confirmation of his grant, and to supply the lack of his own weakened resources, associated with himself one Robin, a man of family and wealth. This did not save him from a host of delays and vexations, and it was not until the spring of 1610 that he found himself in a condition to embark on his new and doubtful venture. Meanwhile an influence, of sinister omen as he thought, had begun to act upon his schemes. The Jesuits were strong at court. One of their number, the famous Father Cotton, was confessor to Henry IV, and on matters of this world as of the next, was ever whispering at the facile ear of the renegade king. New France offered a fresh field of action to the indefatigable Society of Jesus, and Cotton urged upon the royal convert that for the saving of souls some of its members should be attached to the proposed enterprise. The king, profoundly indifferent in matters of religion, saw no evil in a proposal which at least promised to place the Atlantic betwixt him and some of those busy friends whom at heart he deeply mistrusted. Other influences, too, seconded the confessor. Devout ladies of the court, and the queen herself, supplying the lack of virtue with an overflowing piety, burned, we are assured, with a holy zeal for snatching the tribes of the West from the bondage of Satan. Therefore it was insisted that the projected colony should combine the spiritual with the temporal character, or in other words, that Poutrincourt should take Jesuits with him. Pierre Biard, professor of theology at Lyons, was named for the mission, and repaired in haste to Bordeaux, the port of embarkation, where he found no vessel, and no sign of preparation, and here, in wrath and discomfiture, he remained for a whole year. That Poutrincourt was a good Catholic appears from a letter to the Pope, written for him in Latin by Lescarbot, asking a blessing in his enterprise, and assuring his Holiness that one of his grand objects was the saving of souls. But, like other good citizens, he belonged to the national party in the Church, those liberal Catholics, who side by side with the Huguenots had made head against the League, with its Spanish allies, and placed Henry IV upon the throne. The Jesuits, an order Spanish in origin and policy, determined champions of ultramontane principles, the sword and shield of the papacy in its broadest pretensions to spiritual and temporal sway, were to him, as to others of his party, objects of deep dislike and distrust. He feared them in his colony, evaded what he dared not refuse, left Biarki waiting in solitude at Bordeaux, and sought to postpone the evil day by assuring Father Cotton that, though Port Royal was at present in no state to receive the missionaries, preparations should be made to entertain them the next year after a befitting fashion. Poutrincourt owned the barony of St. Just in Champagne, inherited a few years before from his mother. Hence, early in February 1610, he set out in a boat loaded to the gunwales with provisions, furniture, goods, and munitions for Port Royal, descended the rivers Aube and Seine, and reached Dieppe safely with his charge. Here his ship was awaiting him, and on the 26th of February he set sail, giving the slip to the indignant Jesuit at Bordeaux. The tedium of a long passage was unpleasantly broken by mutiny among the crew. It was suppressed, however, and Poutrincourt entered at length the familiar basin of Port Royal. The buildings were still standing, whole and sound, save a partial falling in of the roofs. Even furniture was found untouched in the deserted chambers. The centenarian Membertou was still alive, his leathern, wrinkled visage beaming with welcome. Poutrincourt set himself without delay to the task of Christianizing New France, in an excess of zeal which his desire of proving that Jesuit aid was superfluous may be supposed largely to have reinforced. He had a priest with him, one La Flèche, whom he ordered to the pious work. No time was lost. Membertou first was catechized, confessed his sins, and renounced the devil, whom we are told he had faithfully served during 110 years. His squaws, his children, his grandchildren, and his entire clan were next won over. It was in June, the day of St. John the Baptist, when the naked proselytes, 21 in number, were gathered on the shore at Port Royal. Here was the priest in the vestments of his office; here were gentlemen in gay attire, soldiers, labourers, lackeys, all the infant colony. The converts kneeled, the sacred rite was finished, Te Deum was sung, and the roar of cannon proclaimed this triumph over the powers of darkness. Member 2 was named Henri, after the king; his principal squaw, Marie, after the queen. One of his sons received the name of the Pope, another that of the Dauphin; his daughter was called Marguerite, after the divorced Marguerite de Valois; and in like manner the rest of the squalid company exchanged their barbaric appellatives for the names of princes, nobles, and ladies of rank. The fame of this chef d'oeuvre of Christian piety, as Lescarbot gravely calls it, spread far and wide through the forest, whose denizens, partly out of a notion that the rite would bring good luck, partly to please the French, and partly to share in the good cheer with which the apostolic efforts of Father La Flèche had been sagaciously seconded, came flocking to enrol themselves under the banners of the faith. Their zeal ran high. They would take no refusal. Membertou was for war on all who would not turn Christian. A living skeleton was seen crawling from hut to hut in search of the priest and his saving waters, while another neophyte, at the point of death, asked anxiously whether, in the realms of bliss to which he was bound, pies were to be had comparable to those with which the French regaled him. A formal register of baptisms was drawn up to be carried to France in the returning ship, of which Poutrincourt's son, Biencourt, a spirited youth of 18, was to take charge. He sailed in July, his father keeping him company as far as Port la Hève, whence, bidding the young man farewell, he attempted to return in an open boat to Port Royal. A north wind blew him out to sea, and for 6 days he was out of sight of land, subsisting on rain water wrung from the boat's sail, and on a few wildfowl which he had shot on an island. 5 weeks passed before he could rejoin his colonists, who, despairing of his safety, were about to choose a new chief. Meanwhile, young Biencourt, speeding on his way, heard dire news from a fisherman on the Grand Bank. The knife of Ravaillac had done its work. Henry IV was dead. There is an ancient street in Paris, where a great thoroughfare contracts to a narrow pass, the Rue de la Ferronnerie. Tall buildings overshadow it, packed from pavement to tiles with human life, and from the dingy front of one of them the sculptured head of a man looks down on the throng that ceaselessly defiles beneath. On the 14th of May, 1620, a ponderous coach, studded with fleurs-de-lis and rich with gilding, rolled along this street. In it was a small man, well advanced in life, whose profile, once seen, could not be forgotten: a hooked nose, a protruding chin, a brow full of wrinkles, grizzled hair, a short, grizzled beard, and stiff grey moustaches, bristling like a cat's. One would have thought him some whiskered satyr, grim from the rack of tumultuous years, but his alert, upright port bespoke unshaken vigour, and his clear eye was full of buoyant life. Following on the footway strode a tall, strong, and somewhat corpulent man, with sinister, deep-set eyes and a red beard, his arm and shoulder covered with his cloak. In the throat of the thoroughfare, where the sculptured image of Henry IV still guards the spot, a collision of 2 carts stopped the coach. Ravaillac quickened his pace. In an instant he was at the door. With his cloak dropped from his shoulders, and a long knife in his hand, he set his foot upon a guardstone, thrust his head and shoulders into the coach, and with a frantic force stabbed thrice at the king's heart. A broken exclamation, a gasping convulsion, and then the grim visage drooped on the bleeding breast. Henry breathed his last, and the hope of Europe died with him. The omens were sinister for old France and for new. Marie de Medici, cette grosse banquière, coarse scion of a bad stock, false wife and faithless queen, paramour of an intriguing foreigner, tool of the Jesuits and of Spain, was regent in the minority of her imbecile son. The Huguenots drooped, the national party collapsed, the vigorous hand of Sully was felt no more, and the treasure gathered for a vast and beneficent enterprise became the instrument of despotism and the prey of corruption. Under such auspices, young Biencourt entered the thronged chambers of the Louvre. He gained audience of the Queen, and displayed his list of baptisms, while the ever-present Jesuits failed not to seize him by the button, assuring him not only that the late king had deeply at heart the establishment of their society in Acadia, but that to this end he had made them a grant of 2,000 livres a year. The Jesuits had found an ally, and the intended mission a friend, at court, whose story and whose character are too striking to pass unnoticed. This was a lady of honour to the Queen, Antoinette de Pont, Marquise de Guercheville, once renowned for grace and beauty, and not less conspicuous for qualities rare in the unbridled court of Henry's predecessor, where her youth had been passed. When the Civil War was at its height, the royal heart, leaping with insatiable restlessness from battle to battle, from mistress to mistress, had found a brief repose in the affections of his Corisande, famed in tradition and romance, but Corisande was suddenly abandoned, and the young widow, Madame de Guercheville, became the lodestar of his erratic fancy. It was an evil hour for the Bearnese. Henry sheathed in rusty steel, battling for his crown and his life, and Henry robed in royalty and throned triumphant in the Louvre, alike urged their suit in vain. Unused to defeat, the king's passion rose higher for the obstacle that barred it. On one occasion he was met with an answer not unworthy of record. "Sire, my rank perhaps is not high enough to permit me to be your wife, but my heart is too high to permit me to be your mistress." She left the court and retired to her chateau of La Roche-Guyon, on the Seine, 10 leagues below Paris, where, fond of magnificence, she is said to have lived in much expense and splendour. The indefatigable king, haunted by her memory, made a hunting party in the neighbouring forests, and as evening drew near, separating himself from his courtiers, he sent a gentleman of his train to ask of Madame de Guercheville the shelter of her roof. The reply conveyed a dutiful acknowledgment of the honour, and an offer of the best entertainment within her power. It was the night when Henry, with his little band of horsemen, approached the château, where lights were burning in every window, after a fashion of the day on occasions of welcome to an honoured guest. Pages stood in the gateway, each with a blazing torch, and here, too, were gentlemen of the neighbourhood, gathered to greet their sovereign. Madame de Guercheville came forth, followed by the women of her household, and when the king, unprepared for so benign a welcome, giddy with love and hope, saw her radiant in pearls, and more radiant yet in beauty enhanced by the wavy torchlight and the surrounding shadows, he scarcely dared trust his sentence. "Que vois-je, madame? Est-ce bien vu, et suis-je serait méprise?" He gave her his hand, and she led him within the château, where at the door of the apartment destined for him she left him, with a graceful reverence. The king, nowise disconcerted, did not doubt that she had gone to give orders for his entertainment, when an attendant came to tell him that she had descended to the courtyard and called for her coach. Thither he hastened in alarm. "What! Am I driving you from your house?" "Sire," replied Madame de Guercheville, "where a king is, he should be the sole master; but, for my part, I like to preserve some little authority wherever I may be." With another deep reverence, she entered her coach and disappeared, seeking shelter under the roof of a friend, some 2 leagues off, and leaving the baffled king to such consolation as he might find in a magnificent repast, bereft of the presence of the hostess. Henry could admire the virtue which he could not vanquish, and long after, on his marriage, he acknowledged his sense of her worth by begging her to accept an honourable post near the person of the queen. "Madame," he said, presenting her to Marie de Medici, "I give you a lady of honour, who is a lady of honour indeed." Some 20 years had passed since the adventure of La Roche-Guyon. Madame de Guercheville had outlived the charms which had attracted her royal suitor, but the virtue which repelled him was reinforced by a devotion no less uncompromising. A rosary in her hand and a Jesuit at her side, she realized the utmost wishes of the subtle fathers who had moulded and who guided her. She readily took fire when they told her of the benighted souls of New France, and the wrongs of Father Biard kindled her utmost indignation. She declared herself the protectress of the American missions, and the only difficulty, as a Jesuit writer tells us, was to restrain her zeal within reasonable bounds. She had 2 illustrious coadjutors. The first was the jealous queen, whose unbridled rage and vulgar clamour had made the Louvre a hell. The second was Henriette d'Entregues, Marquise de Verneuil, the crafty and capricious siren who had awakened these conjugal tempests. To this similar coalition were joined many other ladies of the court, for the pious flame, fanned by the Jesuits, spread through the hall and boudoir, and fair votaries of the loves and graces found it a more grateful task to win heaven for the heathen than to merit it for themselves. Young Biencourt saw it vain to resist. Biard must go with him in the returning ship, and also another Jesuit, Ennemond Mas. The two fathers repaired to Dieppe, wafted on the wind of court favour, which they never doubted would bear them to their journey's end. Not so, however. Poutrincourt and his associates, in the dearth of their own resources, had bargained with two Huguenot merchants of Dieppe, Dujardin and Duquesne, to equip and load the vessel, in consideration of their becoming partners in the expected profits. Their indignation was extreme when they saw the intended passengers. They declared that they would not aid in building up a colony for the profit of the King of Spain, nor risk their money in a venture where Jesuits were allowed to intermeddle, and they closed with a flat refusal to receive them on board, unless, they added with patriotic sarcasm, the Queen would direct them to transport the whole order beyond sea. Biard and Mas insisted, on which the merchants demanded reimbursement for their outlay, as they would have no further concern in the business. Biard communicated with Father Cotton with Madame de Guercheville. No more was needed. The zealous lady of honour, indignant, says Biard, to see the effects of hell prevail, and resolved that Satan should not remain master of the field, set on foot a subscription and raised an ample fund within the precincts of the court. Biard, in the name of the Province of France of the Order of Jesus, bought out the interest of the two merchants for 3,800 livres, thus constituting the Jesuits equal partners in business with their enemies. Nor was this all, for out of the ample proceeds of the subscription, he lent to the needy associates a further sum of 737 livres, and advanced 1,225 more to complete the outfit of the ship. Well pleased, the triumphant priests now embarked, and friend and foe set sail together on the 26th of January, 1611. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part 2, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman. Part 2. Samuel Champlain and His Associates. Chapter 6. Jesuits in Acadia, 1611 and 1612. The voyage was one of inordinate length, beset, too, with icebergs larger and taller, according to the Jesuit voyagers, than the church of Notre Dame. But on the day of Pentecost their ship, the Grace of God, anchored before Port Royal. Then first were seen, in the wilderness of New France, the close black cap, the close back robe of the Jesuit father, and the features seamed with study and thought and discipline. Then first did this mighty Proteus, this many-colored Society of Jesus, enter upon that rude field of toil and woe, where, in after years, the devoted zeal of its apostles was to lend dignity to their order and do honor to humanity. Few were the regions of the known world to which the potent brotherhood had not stretched the vast network of its influence. Jesuits had disputed in theology with the bronzes of Japan, and taught astronomy to the mandarins of China, had wrought prodigies of sudden conversion among the followers of Brahmin-Ra, preached the papal supremacy to Abyssinian schismatics, carried the cross among the savages of Caffraria, wrought reputed miracles in Brazil, and gathered the tribes of Paraguay beneath their paternal sway. And now, with the aid of the Virgin and her votary at court, they would build another empire among the tribes of New France. The omens were sinister, and the outset was unpropitious. The society was destined to reap few laurels from their brief apostleship of Biard and Mas. When the voyagers landed, they found at Port Royal a band of half-famished men, eagerly expecting their succor. The voyage of 4 months had, however, nearly exhausted their own very moderate stock of provisions, and the mutual congratulations of the old colonists and the new wave were dampened by a vision of starvation. A friction, too, speedily declared itself between the spiritual and the temporal powers. Pontgrave's son, then trading on the coast, had exasperated the Indians by an outrage on one of their women, and, dreading the wrath of Poutrincourt, had fled to the woods. Biard saw fit to take his part, remonstrated for him with vehemence, gained his pardon, received his confession, and absolved him. The Jesuits say that he was treated with great consideration by Poutrincourt, and that he should be forever beholden to him. The latter, however, chafed at Biard's interference. "Father," he said, "I know my duty, and I beg you will leave me to do it. I, with my sword, have hopes of paradise, as well as you with your breviary. Show me my path to heaven. I will show you yours on earth." He soon set sail for France, leaving his son Baincourt in charge. This hardy young sailor, of ability and character beyond his years, had on his visit to court received the post of vice-admiral in the seas of New France, and in this capacity had a certain authority over the trading vessels of St. Malo and Rochelle, several of which were upon the coast. To compel the recognition of this authority, and also to purchase provisions, he set out with Biard in a boat filled with armed followers. His first collision was with young Pontgrave, who with a few men had built a trading hut on the St. John, where he proposed to winter. Meeting with resistance, Baincourt took the whole party prisoners, in spite of the remonstrances of Biard. Next, proceeding along the coast, he levied tribute on 4 or 5 traders wintering at St. Croix, and, continuing his course to the Kennebec, found the Indians of that region greatly enraged at the conduct of certain English adventurers, who 3 or 4 years before had, as they said, set dogs upon them and otherwise maltreated them. These were the colonists under Popham and Gilbert, who in 1607 and 1608 made an abortive attempt to settle near the mouth of the river. Nothing now was left of them but their deserted forts. The neighboring Indians were Abenakis, one of the tribes included by the French under the general name of Armachaquois. Their disposition was doubtful, and it needed all the coolness of young Baincourt to avoid a fatal collision. On one occasion a curious incident took place. The French met 6 canoes full of warriors, descending the Kennebec, and as neither party trusted the other, the 2 encamped on opposite banks of the river. In the evening the Indians began to sing and dance. Biard suspected these proceedings to be an invocation of the devil, and in order, he says, to thwart this accursed tyrant, I made our people sing a few church hymns, such as the Salve, and Ave Man Stella, and others. But being once in train, and getting to the end of their spiritual songs, they fell to singing such others as they knew, and when these gave out, they took to mimicking the dancing and singing of the Armachaquois on the other side of the water. And, as Frenchmen are naturally good mimics, they did it so well that the Armachaquois stopped to listen, at which our people stopped too, and then the Indians began again. You would have laughed to hear them, for they were like 2 choirs answering each other in concerts, and you would hardly have known the real Armachaquois from the sham ones. Before the capture of young Pontgrave, Biard made him a visit at his camp, 6 leagues up from the St. John. Pontgrave's men were sailors from St. Malo, between whom and the other Frenchmen there was much ill blood. Biard had hardly entered the river when he saw the evening sky crimsoned with the dancing fires of a superb aurora borealis, and he and his attendants marveled what evil thing the prodigy might portend. Their Indian companions said that it was a sign of war. In fact, the night after they had joined Pontgrave, a furious quarrel broke out in the camp, and with abundant shouting, gesticulating and swearing, and, says the father, I do not doubt that an accursed band of furious and sanguinary spirits were hovering about us all night, expecting every moment to see a horrible massacre of the few Christians in those parts, but the goodness of God bridled their malice. No blood was shed, and on the next day the squall ended in a fine calm. He did not like the Indians, whom he describes as lazy, gluttonous, irreligious, treacherous, cruel, and licentious. He makes an exception in favor of Memberton, whom he calls the greatest, most renowned, and most redoubted savage that ever lived in the memory of man, and especially commends him for contenting himself with but one wife, hardly a superlative merit in a centenarian. Bayard taught him to say the Lord's Prayer, though at the petition, "Give us this day our daily bread," the chief remonstrated, saying, "If I ask for nothing but bread, I shall get no fish or moose meat." His protracted career was now drawing to a close, and being brought to the settlement in a dying state, he was placed in Bayard's bed and attended by the 2 Jesuits. He was as remarkable in person as in character, for he was bearded like a Frenchman. Though alone among luscious converts, the faith seemed to have left some impression upon him. He insisted on being buried with his heathen forefathers, but was persuaded to forego a wish fatal to his salvation, and slept at last in consecrated ground. Another of the scanty fruits of the mission was a little girl on the point of death, whom Bayard had asked her parents to give him for baptism. "Take her and keep her if you like," was the reply, "for she is no better than a dead dog." "We accepted the offer," says Bayard, "in order to show them the difference between Christianity and their impiety, and after giving her what care we could, together with some instruction, we baptized her. We named her after Madame the Marquise de Guercheville, in gratitude for the benefits we have received from that lady, who can now rejoice that her name is already in heaven, for a few days after baptism, the chosen soul flew to that place of glory." Bayard's greatest difficulty was with the Micmac language. Young Binecourt was his best interpreter, and on common occasions served him well. But the moment that religion was in question, he was, as it were, stricken dumb. The reason being that the language was totally without abstract terms. Bayard resolutely set himself to the study of it, a hard and thorny path, on which he made small progress, and often went astray. Seated, pencil in hand, before some Indian squatting on the floor, whom with the bribe of a mouldy biscuit he had lured into the hut, he plied him with questions which he often neither would nor could answer. What was the Indian word for faith, hope, charity, sacrament, baptism, Eucharist, Trinity, incarnation? The perplexed savage, willing to amuse himself, and impelled as Bayard thinks by the devil, gave him scurrilous and unseemly phrases as the equivalent of things holy, which, studiously incorporated into the Father's Indian catechism, produced on his pupils an effect the reverse of that intended. Bayard's colleague, Masse, was equally zealous, and still less fortunate. He tried a forest life among the Indians, with signal ill success. Hard fare, smoke, filth, the scolding of squaws, and the cries of children reduced him to a forlorn condition of body and mind, wore him to a skeleton, and sent him back to Port Royal without a single convert. The dark months wore slowly on. A band of half-famished men gathered about the huge fires of the barn-like hall, moody, sullen, and quarrelsome. Discord was here in the black robe of the Jesuit and the brown capote of the rival trader. The position of the wretched little colony may well provoke reflection. Here lay the shaggy continent, from Florida to the Pole, outstretched in savage slumber along the sea, the stern domain of nature, or to adopt the ready solution of the Jesuit, a realm of the powers of night, blasted beneath the scepter of hell. On the banks of James River was a nest of woe-begone Englishmen, a handful of Dutch fur traders at the mouth of the Hudson, and a few shivering Frenchmen among the snowdrifts of Acadia. While deep within the wild monotony of desolation, on the icy verge of the great northern river, the hand of Champlain upheld the flageolets on the rock of Quebec. These were the advance guard, the forlorn hope of civilization, messengers of promise to a desert continent. Yet, unconscious of their high function, not content with inevitable woes, they were rent by petty jealousies and miserable feuds, while each of these detached fragments of rival nationalities scarcely able to maintain its own wretched existence on a few square miles, begrudged to the others the smallest share in a domain which all the nations of Europe could hardly have sufficed to fill. One evening, as the forlorn tenants of Port Royal sat together disconsolate, Bayard was seized with a spirit of prophecy. He called upon Binecourt to serve out the little of wine that remained, a proposal which met with high favor from the company present, though apparently with none from the youthful vice-admiral. The wine was ordered, however, and as an unwonted cheer ran round the circle, the Jesuit announced that an inward voice told him how, within a month, they should see a ship from France. In truth, they saw one within a week. On the 23rd of January, 1612, arrived a small vessel laden with a moderate store of provisions and abundant seeds of future strife. This was the expected succor sent by Poutrincourt. A series of ruinous voyages had exhausted his resources, but he had stalked all on the success of the colony, had even brought his family to Acadia, and he would not leave them and his companions to perish. His credit was gone, his hopes were dashed, yet assistance was proffered, and in his extremity he was forced to accept it. It came from Madame de Courcheville and her Jesuit advisers. She offered to buy the interest of 1,000 crowns in the enterprise. The ill-omened succor could not be refused. But this was not all. The zealous protectress of the missions obtained from De Monts, whose fortune, like those of Poutrincourt's, had ebbed low, a transfer of all his claims to the lands of Acadia, while the young King Louis XIII was persuaded to give her, in addition, a new grant of all the territory of North America, from the St. Lawrence to Florida. Thus did Madame de Courcheville, or in other words, the Jesuits who used her name as a cover, become proprietors of the great part of the future United States and British provinces. The English colony of Virginia and the Dutch trading houses of New York were included within the limits of this destined northern Paraguay, while Port Royal, the seigneury of the unfortunate Poutrincourt, was encompassed, like a petty island, by the vast domain of the Society of Jesus. They could not deprive him of it, since his title had been confirmed by the late king, but they flattered themselves, to borrow their own language, that he would be confined as in a prison. His grant, however, had been vaguely worded, and while they held him restricted to an insignificant patch of ground, he claimed lordship over a wide and indefinite territory. Here was argument for endless strife. Other interests, too, were adverse. Poutrincourt, in his discouragement, had abandoned his plan of liberal colonization, and now thought of nothing but beaver skins. He wished to make a trading post. The Jesuits wished to make a mission. When the vessel anchored before Port Royal, Binecourt, with disgust and anger, saw another Jesuit landed at the pier. This was Gilbert de Thet, a lay brother versed in affairs of this world, who had come out as representative and administrator of Madame de Courcheville. Poutrincourt, also, had his agent on board, and without the loss of a day the two began to quarrel. A truce ensued, then a smothered feud, pervading the whole colony and ending in a notable explosion. The Jesuits, chafing under the sway of Binecourt, had withdrawn without ceremony, and betaken themselves to the vessel, intending to sail for France. Binecourt, exasperated at such a breach of discipline, and fearing their representations at court, ordered them to return, adding that, since the Queen had commended them to his especial care, he could not in conscience lose sight of them. The indignant fathers excommunicated him. On this, the Sycamore Louis, son of the grisly convert Membertou, begged leave to kill them. But Binecourt would not countenance this summary mode of relieving his embarrassment. He again, in the king's name, ordered the clerical mutineers to return to the fort. Bayard declared that he would not, threatened to excommunicate any who should lay hands on him, and called the vice-admiral a robber. His wrath, however, soon cooled. He yielded to necessity, and came quietly ashore, where, for the next 3 months, neither he nor his colleagues would say mass, or perform any office of religion. At length, a change came over him, and he made advances of peace, prayed that the past might be forgotten, said Mass again, and closed with a petition that Brother Duthat might be allowed to go to France in a trading vessel, then on the other coast. His petition being granted, he wrote to Poutrincourt a letter overflowing with praises of his son, and charged with this missive, Duthat set sail. End of chapter 6. Recording by Katie Riley. March 2009.
Chapter 7 of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part 2, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Penfold. Pioneers of France in the New World, by Francis Parkman. Part 2, Samuel Champlain and His Associates. Chapter 7, La Saucier to Argall, 1613. Pending these squabbles, the Jesuits at home were far from idle. Bent on ridding themselves of Poutrincourt, they seized, in satisfaction of debts due them, all the cargo of his returning vessel, and involved him in a network of litigation. If we accept his own statements in a letter to his friend Lescarbot, he was outrageously misused and indeed defrauded by his clerical co-partners, who at length had him thrown into prison. Here, exasperated, weary, sick of Acadia, and anxious for the wretched exiles who looked to him for succour, the unfortunate man fell ill. Regaining his liberty, he again addressed himself, with what strength remained, to the forlorn task of sending relief to his son and his comrades. Scarcely had Brother Gilbert Duthay arrived in France, when Madame de Guercheville and her Jesuits, strong in court favour and in the charity of wealthy penitents, prepared to take possession of their empire beyond sea. Contributions were asked, and not in vain, for the sagacious fathers, mindful of every spring of influence, had deeply studied the mazes of feminine psychology, and then, as now, were favourite confessors of the fair. It was on the 12th of March, 1613, that the Mayflower of the Jesuits sailed from Honfleur for the shores of New England. She was the Jonas, formerly in the service of De Monts, a small craft bearing 48 sailors and colonists, including 2 Jesuits, Father Quintin and Brother Duthay. She carried horses, too, and goats, and was abundantly stored with all things needful by the pious munificence of her patrons. A courtier named La Saucier was chief of the colony. Captain Charles Fleury commanded the ship, and, as she winged her way across the Atlantic, benedictions hovered over her from lordly halls and perfumed chambers. On the 16th of May, La Saucier touched at La Heve, where he heard Mass, planted a cross, and displayed the scutcheon of Madame de Guercheville. Thence, passing on to Port Royal, he found Biard, Massé, their servant boy, an apothecary, and 1 man beside. Biencourt and his followers were scattered about the woods and shores, digging the tuberous roots called ground-nuts, catching alewives in the brooks, and by similar expedients sustaining their miserable existence. Taking the 2 Jesuits on board, the voyagers steered for the Penobscot. A fog rose upon the sea. They sailed to and fro, groping their way in blindness, straining their eyes through the mist, and trembling each instant lest they should descry the black outline of some deadly reef and the ghostly death-dance of the breakers, but heaven heard their prayers. At night they could see the stars. The sun rose resplendent on a laughing sea, and his morning beams streamed fair and full on the wild heights of the island of Mount Desert. They entered a bay that stretched inland between iron-bound shores, and gave it the name of Saint Sauveur. It is now called Frenchman's Bay. They saw a coastline of weather-beaten crags set thick with spruce and fir, the surf-washed cliffs of Great Head and Schooner Head, the rocky front of Newport Mountain patched with ragged woods, the arid domes of Dry Mountain and Green Mountain, the round bristly backs of the Porcupine Islands, and the waving outline of the Goldsboro Hills. La Saucier cast anchor not far from Schooner Head, and here he lay till evening. The jet-black shade betwixt crags and sea, the pines along the cliff penciled against the fiery sunset, the dreamy slumber of distant mountains bathed in shadowy purples, Such is the scene that in this our day greets the wandering artist, the roving collegian bivouacked on the shore, or the pilgrim from stifled cities renewing his lated strength in the mighty life of nature. Perhaps they then greeted the adventurous Frenchman. There was peace on the wilderness and peace on the sea, but none in this missionary bark, pioneer of Christianity and civilization. A rabble of angry sailors clamored on her deck, ready to mutiny over the terms of their engagement. Should the time of their stay be reckoned from their landing at La Heve, or from their anchoring at Mount Desert? Fleury, the naval commander, took their part. Sailor, courtier, and priest gave tongue together in vociferous debate. Poutrincourt was far away, a ruined man, and the intractable vice-admiral had ceased from troubling. Yet not the less were the omens of the pious enterprise sinister and dark. The company, however, went ashore, raised a cross, and heard mass. At a distance in the woods they saw the smoke signal of Indians, whom Biard lost no time in visiting. Some of them were from a village on the shore, 3 leagues westward. They urged the French to go with them to their wigwams. The astute savages had learned already how to deal with a Jesuit. "Our great chief Asticu is there. He wishes for baptism. He is very sick. He will die unbaptized. He will burn in hell, and it will be all your fault." This was enough. Biard embarked in a canoe, and they paddied him to the spot where he found the great chief Asticu in his wigwam with a heavy cold in the head. Disappointed of his charitable purpose, the priest consoled himself with observing the beauties of the neighboring shore, which seemed to him better fitted than St. Saviour for the intended settlement. It was a gentle slope, descending to the water, covered with tall grass, and backed by rocky hills. It looked southeast upon a harbor where a fleet might ride at anchor, sheltered from the gales by a cluster of islands. The ship was brought to the spot, and the colonists disembarked. First they planted a cross. Then they began their labors, and with their labors their quarrels. Le Saussier, zealous for agriculture, wished to break ground and raise crops immediately. The rest opposed him, wishing first to be housed and fortified. Fleury demanded that the ship should be unladen, and Le Saussier would not consent. Debate ran high, when suddenly all was harmony, and the disputants were friends once more in the pacification of a common danger. Far out at sea, beyond the islands that sheltered their harbor, they saw an approaching sail, and as she drew near, straining their anxious eyes, they could descry the red flags that streamed from her masthead and her stern, then the black muzzles of her cannon. They counted 7 on a side, then the throng of men upon her decks. The wind was brisk and fair, all her sails were set. She came on, writes a spectator, more swiftly than an arrow. 6 years before, in 1607, the ships of Captain Newport had conveyed to the banks of James River the first vital germ of English colonization on the continent. Noble and wealthy speculators, with Hispaniola, Mexico, and Peru for their inspiration, had combined to gather the fancied golden harvest of Virginia, received a charter from the Crown, and taken possession of their El Dorado. From tavern, gaming house, and brothel was drawn the staple, the colony. Ruined gentlemen, prodigal sons, disreputable retainers, debauched tradesmen. Yet it would be foul slander to affirm that the founders of Virginia were all of this stamp. For among the riotous crew were men of worth, and, above them all, a hero disguised by the homeliest of names. Again and again, in direst woe and jeopardy, the infant settlement owed its life to the heart and hand of John Smith. Several years had elapsed since Newport's voyage, and the colony, depleted by famine, disease, and an Indian war, had been recruited by fresh emigration, when Samuel Argall arrived at Jamestown, captain of an illicit trading vessel. He was a man of ability and force, one of those compounds of craft and daring in which the age was fruitful, for the rest, unscrupulous and grasping. In the spring of 1613 he achieved a characteristic exploit, the abduction of Pocahontas, that most interesting of young squaws, or, to borrow the style of the day, of Indian princesses. Sailing up the Potomac, he lured her on board his ship, and then carried off the benefactress of the colony a prisoner to Jamestown. Here a young man of family, Rolfe, became enamored of her, married her with more than ordinary ceremony, and thus secured a firm alliance between her tribesmen and the English. Meanwhile Argall had set forth on another enterprise. With a ship of 130 tons, carrying 14 guns and 60 men, He sailed in May for islands off the coast of Maine to fish, as he says, for cod. He had a more important errand, for Sir Thomas Dale, governor of Virginia, had commissioned him to expel the French from any settlement they might have made within the limits of King James's patents. Thick fogs involved him, and when the weather cleared he found himself not far from the Bay of Penobscot. Canoes came out from shore. The Indians climbed the ship's side, and, as they gained the deck, greeted the astonished English with an odd pantomime of bows and flourishes, which, in the belief of the latter, could have been learned from none but Frenchmen. By signs, too, and by often repeating the word Norman, by which they always designated the French, they betrayed the presence of the latter. Argall questioned them as well as his total ignorance of their language would permit, and learned, by signs, the position and numbers of the colonists. Clearly they were no match for him. Assuring the Indians that the Normans were his friends, and that he longed to see them, he retained one of the visitors as a guide, dismissed the rest with presents, and shaped his course for Mount Desert. Now the wild heights rose in view. Now the English could see the masts of a small ship anchored in the Sound, and now, as they rounded the islands, 4 white tents were visible on the grassy slope between the water and the woods. They were a gift from the Queen to Madame de Guercheville and her missionaries. Argall's men prepared for fight, while their Indian guide, amazed, broke into a howl of lamentation. On shore all was confusion. Beluel, the pilot, went to reconnoitre, and ended by hiding among the islands. Le Saussier lost presence of mind, and did nothing for defence. Lamotte, his lieutenant, with Captain Fleury, an ensign, a sergeant, the Jesuit Douthet, and a few of the bravest men, hastened on board the vessel, but had no time to cast loose her cables. Argall bore down on them with a furious din of drums and trumpets, showed his broadside, and replied to their hail with a volley of cannon and musket shot. "Fire! Fire!" screamed Fleury, but there was no gunner to obey till Douthet seized and applied the match. The cannon made as much noise as the enemy's, writes Biard, but, as the inexperienced artillerist forgot to aim the piece, no other result ensued. Another storm of musketry, and Brother Gilbert Douthet rolled helpless on the deck. The French ship was mute. The English plied her for a time with shot, then lowered a boat and boarded. Under the awnings which covered her, dead and wounded men lay strewn about her deck, and among them the brave lay Brother, smouldering in his blood. He had his wish, for, on leaving France, he had prayed with uplifted hands that he might not return, but perish in that holy enterprise. Like the order of which he was a humble member, he was a compound of qualities in appearance contradictory. Lamotte, sword in hand, showed fight to the last, and won the esteem of his captors. The English landed without meeting any show of resistance, and ranged at will among the tents, the piles of baggage and stores, and the buildings and defences newly begun. Argall asked for the commander, but Le Saussier had fled to the woods. The crafty Englishman seized his chests, caused the locks to be picked, searched till he found the royal letters and commissions, withdrew them, replaced everything else as he had found it, and again closed the lids. In the morning Le Saussier, between the English and starvation, preferred the former, and issued from his hiding-place. Argall received him with studious courtesy. That country, he said, belonged to his master, King James. Doubtless they had authority from their own sovereign for thus encroaching upon it, and, for his part, he was prepared to yield all respect to the commissions of the King of France, that the peace between the two nations might not be disturbed. Therefore he prayed that the commissions might be shown to him. Le Saussier opened his chests. The royal signature was nowhere to be found. At this Argall's courtesy was changed to wrath. He denounced the Frenchmen as robbers and pirates who deserved the gallows, removed their property on board his ship, and spent the afternoon in dividing it among his followers. The disconsolate French remained on the scene of their woes, where the greedy sailors, as they came ashore, would snatch from them, now a cloak, now a hat, and now a doublet, till the unfortunate colonists were left half naked. In other respects the English treated their captives well, except 2 of them, who they flogged, and Argall, whom Biard, after recounting his knavery, calls a gentleman of noble courage, having gained his point, returned to his former courtesy. But how to dispose of the prisoners? 15 of them, including Le Saussier and the Jesuit Massé, were turned adrift in an open boat, at the mercy of the wilderness and the sea. Nearly all were landsmen, but while their unpractised hands were struggling with the oars, they were joined among the islands by the fugitive pilot and his boat's crew. Worn and half-starved, the united bands made their perilous way eastward, stopping from time to time to hear mass, make a procession, or catch codfish. Thus sustained in the spirit and in the flesh, cheered too by the Indians, who proved fast friends in need, they crossed the Bay of Fundy, doubled Cape Sable, and followed the southern coast of Nova Scotia, till they happily fell in with 2 French trading vessels, which bore them in safety to St. Malo. The end of Chapter 7. Recording by Mark Penfold.
Chapter 8 of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part 2, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman, Part 2, Samuel Champlain and His Associates, Chapter 8, Ruin of French Arcadia, 1613 to 1615. Praised be God! Behold, 2/3 of our company safe in France, telling their strange adventures to their relatives and friends. And now you will wish to know what befell the rest of us. Thus writes Father Biard, who, with his companions in misfortune, 14 in all, prisoners on board Argall's ship and the prize, were borne captive to Virginia. Old Point Comfort was reached at length, the site of Fortress Monroe, Hampton Roads, renowned in our day for the sea fight of the Titans, Sewell's Point, the Rip Raps, Newport News, all household words in the ears of this generation. Now, far on their right, buried in the deep shade of immemorial verdure, lay untrodden and voiceless the fields where stretched the leaguered lines of Washington, where the lilies of France floated beside the banners of the newborn republic, and where in later years embattled treason confronted the manhood of an outraged nation. And now, before them they could descry the mast of small craft at anchor, a cluster of rude dwellings fresh from the axe, scattered tenements, and fields green with tobacco. Throughout the voyage the prisoners had been soothed with flattering tales of the benignity of the governor of Virginia, Sir Thomas Dale, of his love of the French, and his respect for the memory of Henry IV., to whom, they were told, he was much beholden for countenance and favour. On their landing at Jamestown, this consoling picture was reversed. The governor fumed and blustered, talked of halter and gallows, and declared that he would hang them all. In vain Argall remonstrated, urging that he had pledged his word for their lives. Dale, outraged by their invasion of British territory, was deaf to all appeals, till Argall, driven to extremity, displayed the stolen commissions, and proclaimed his stratagem, of which the French themselves had to that moment been ignorant. As they were accredited by their government, their lives at least were safe. Yet the wrath of Sir Thomas Dale still burned high. He summoned his council, and they resolved promptly to wipe off all the stain of French intrusion from shores which King James claimed as his own. Their action was utterly unauthorized. The 2 kingdoms were at peace. James I, by the patents of 1606, had granted all North America, from the 34th to the 45th degree of latitude, to the 2 companies of London and Plymouth, Virginia being assigned to the former, while to the latter were given Maine and Arcadia, with adjacent regions. Of these, though as yet the claimants had not taken possession of them, the authorities of Virginia had no colour of jurisdiction. England claimed all North America, in virtue of the discovery of Cabot, and Sir Thomas Dale became the self-constituted champion of British rights, not the less zealous that his championship promised a harvest of booty. Argall's ship, the captured ship of La Saussaye, and another smaller vessel, were at once equipped and dispatched on their errand of havoc. Argall commanded, and Biard, with Quentin and several others of the prisoners, were embarked with him. They shaped their course first for Mount Desert. Here they landed, levelled all La Saussaye's unfinished defences, cut down the French cross, and planted one of their own in its place. Next they sought out the island of St. Croix, seized a quantity of salt, and razed to the ground all that remained of the dilapidated buildings of De Monts. They crossed the Bay of Fundy to Port Royal, guided, says Biard, by an Indian chief, an improbable assertion, since the natives of these coasts hated the English as much as they loved the French, and now well knew the designs of the former. The unfortunate settlement was tenantless. Biencourt, with some of his men, was on a visit to neighbouring bands of Indians, while the rest were reaping in the fields on the river, 2 leagues above the fort. Succour from Poutrincourt had arrived during the summer. The magazines were by no means empty, and there were cattle, horses, and hogs in adjacent fields and enclosures. Exulting at their good fortune, Argyll's men butchered or carried off the animals, ransacked the buildings, plundered them even to the locks and bolts of the doors, and then laid the whole in ashes. And may it please the Lord, adds the pious Biard, that the sins therein committed may likewise have been consumed in that burning. Having demolished Port Royal, the marauders went in boats up the river to the fields where the reapers were at work. These fled, and took refuge behind the ridge of a hill, whence they gazed helplessly on the destruction of their harvest. Biard approached them, and, according to the declaration of Poutrincourt, made and attested before the Admiralty of Guyenne, tried to persuade them to desert his son, Biencourt, and take service with Argyll. The reply of one of the men gave little encouragement for further parley. "Begone, or I will split your head with this hatchet." There is flat contradiction here between the narrative of the Jesuit and the accounts of Poutrincourt and contemporary English writers, who agree in affirming that Biard, out of indigestible malice that he had conceived against Biencourt, encouraged the attack on the settlements of St. Croix and Port Royal, and guided the English thither. The priest himself admits that both French and English regarded him as traitor, and that his life was in danger. While Argyll's ship was at anchor, a Frenchman shouted to the English from a distance, that they would do well to kill him. The master of the ship, a Puritan, in his abomination of priests, and above all of Jesuits, was at the same time urging his commander to set Biard ashore, and leave him to the mercy of his countrymen. In this pass he was saved, to adopt his own account, by what he calls his simplicity; for he tells us, that while instigated, like the rest of his enemies, by the devil, the robber and the robbed were joining hands to ruin him, he was on his knees before Argyll, begging him to take pity on the French, and leave them a boat, together with provisions to sustain their miserable lives through the winter. This spectacle of charity, he further says, so moved the noble heart of the commander, that he closed his ears to all the promptings of foreign and domestic malice. The English had scarcely re-embarked, when Biencourt arrived with his followers, and beheld the scene of destruction. Hopelessly outnumbered, he tried to lure Argyll and some of his officers into an ambuscade, but they would not be trapped. Biencourt now asked for an interview. The word of honour was mutually given, and the 2 chiefs met in a meadow not far from the demolished dwellings. An anonymous English writer says Biencourt offered to transfer his allegiance to King James, on condition of being permitted to remain at Port Royal and carry on the fur trade under a guarantee of English protection, but that Argyll would not listen to his overtures. The interview proved a stormy one. Biard says that the Frenchman vomited against him every species of malignant abuse. In the meantime, he adds, you will considerately observe to what madness the evil spirit exciteth those who sell themselves to him. According to Poutrincourt, Argyll admitted that the priest had urged him to attack Port Royal. Certain it is that Biencourt demanded his surrender, frankly declaring that he meant to hang him. Whilst they were discoursing together, says the old English writer above mentioned, one of the savages, rushing suddenly forth from the woods, and licentiated to come near, did after this manner, with such broken French as he had, earnestly meditate a peace, wondering why they that seemed to be of one country should verse each other with such hostility, and that with such a form of habit and gesture as made them both to laugh. His work done, and, as he thought, the French settlements of Acadia effectually blotted out, Argyll set sail for Virginia on the 13th of November. Scarcely was he at sea when a storm scattered the vessels. Of the smallest of the 3 nothing was ever heard. Argyll, severely buffeted, reached his port in safety, having first, it is said, compelled the Dutch at Manhattan to acknowledge, for a time, the sovereignty of King James. The captured ship of La Saussay, with Biard and his colleague Quentin on board, was forced to yield to the fury of the western gales, and bear away for the Azores. To Biard the change of destination was not unwelcome. He stood in fear of the truculent governor of Virginia, and his tempest-rocked slumbers were haunted with unpleasant visions of a rope's end. It seems that some of the French at Port Royal, disappointed in their hope of hanging him, had commended him to Sir Thomas Dale as a proper subject for the gallows, drawing up a paper, signed by 6 of them, and containing allegations of a nature well fitted to kindle the wrath of that vehement official. The vessel was commanded by Tournelle, Argyll's lieutenant, apparently an officer of merit, a scholar and linguist. He had treated his prisoner with great kindness, because, says the latter, He esteemed and loved him for his naive simplicity and ingenuous candour. But of late, thinking his kindness misplaced, he had changed it for an extreme coldness, preferring, in the words of Biard himself, to think that the Jesuit had lied, rather than so many who accused him. Water ran low, provisions began to fail, and they eked out their meagre supply by butchering the horses taken at Port Royal. At length they came within sight of Fayal, when a new terror seized the minds of the two Jesuits. Might not the Englishmen fear that their prisoners would denounce them to the fervent Catholics of that island as pirates and sacrilegious kidnappers of priests? From such hazard the escape was obvious. What more simple than to drop the priests into the sea? In truth, the English had no little dread of the results of conference between the Jesuits and the Portuguese authorities of Fayal, but the conscience or humanity of Tournelle revolted at the expedient which awakened such apprehension in the troubled mind of Biard. He contented himself with requiring that the two priests should remain hidden while the ship lay off the port. Biard does not say that he enforced the demand either by threats or by the imposition of oaths. He and his companion, however, rigidly complied with it, lying close in the hold or under the boats, while suspicious officials searched the ship, a proof, he triumphantly declares, of the audacious malice which has asserted it is a tenet of Rome that no faith need be kept with heretics. Once more at sea, Tournelle shaped his course for home, having with some difficulty gained a supply of water and provisions at Fayal. All was now harmony between him and his prisoners. When he reached Pembroke, in Wales, the appearance of the vessel, a French craft in English hands, again drew upon him the suspicion of piracy. The Jesuits, dangerous witnesses among the Catholics of Fayal, could at the worst do little harm with the Vice Admiral at Pembroke. To him, therefore, he led the prisoners, in the sable garb of their order, now much the worse for wear, and commended them as persons without reproach, wherein, adds the modest father, he spoke the truth. The result of their evidence was, we are told, that Tournelle was henceforth treated, not as a pirate, but, according to his deserts, as an honourable gentleman. This interview led to a meeting with certain dignitaries of the Anglican Church, who, much interested in an encounter with Jesuits in their robes, were filled, says Biard, with wonder and admiration at what they were told of their conduct. He explains that these churchmen differ widely in form and doctrine from English Calvinists, who, he says, are called Puritans, and he adds that they are superior in every respect to these, whom they detest as an execrable pest. Biard was sent to Dover and thence to Calais, returning perhaps to the tranquil honours of his chair of theology at Lyons. La Saussaye, La Motte, Fleury, and other prisoners were at various times sent from Virginia to England, and ultimately to France. Madame de Guercheville, her pious designs crushed in the bud, seems to have gained no further satisfaction than the restoration of the vessel. The French ambassador complained of the outrage, but answer was postponed, and in the troubled state of France the matter appears to have been dropped. Argall, whose violent and crafty character was offset by a gallant bearing and various traits of martial virtue, became deputy governor of Virginia, and, under a military code, ruled the colony with a rod of iron. He enforced the observance of Sunday with an edifying rigour. Those who absented themselves from church were, for the first offence, imprisoned for the night, and reduced to slavery for a week; for the second offence, enslaved a month, and for the third, a year. Nor was he less strenuous in his devotion to Mammon. He enriched himself by extortion and wholesale peculation, and his audacious dexterity, aided by the countenance of the Earl of Warwick, who is said to have had a trading connection with him, thwarted all the efforts of the Company to bring him to an account. In 1623 he was knighted by the hand of King James. Early in the spring following the English attack, Poutrincourt came to Port Royal. He found the place in ashes, and his unfortunate son, with the men under his command, wandering houseless in the forests. They had passed a winter of extreme misery, sustaining their wretched existence with roots, the buds of trees, and lichens peeled from the rocks. Despairing of his enterprise, Poutrincourt returned to France. In the next year, 1615, during the civil disturbances which followed the marriage of the king, command was given him of the royal forces destined for the attack on Méry, and here, happier in his death than in his life, he fell sword in hand. In spite of their reverses the French kept hold on Acadia. Biencourt, partially at least, rebuilt Port Royal, while winter after winter the smoke of fur traders' huts curled into the still, sharp air of these frosty wilds, till at length, with happier auspices, plans of settlement were resumed. Rude hands strangled the northern Paraguay in its birth. Its beginnings had been feeble, but behind were the forces of a mighty organization, at once devoted and ambitious, enthusiastic and calculating. 7 years later the Mayflower landed her emigrants at Plymouth. What would have been the issues had the zeal of the pious Lady of Honor preoccupied New England with a Jesuit colony? In an obscure stroke of lawless violence began the strife of France and England, Protestantism and Rome, which for a century and a half shook the struggling communities of North America, and closed at last in the memorable triumph on the Plains of Abraham. End of chapter 4. Chapter 9 of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part 2, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman. Part 2, Samuel Champlain and His Associates, Chapter 9, Champlain at Quebec, 1608–1609. A lonely ship sailed up the St. Lawrence. The white whales floundering in the bay of Tadoussac, and the wild duck diving as the foam prow drew near. There was no life but these in all that watery solitude, 20 miles from shore to shore. The ship was from Honfleur, and was commanded by Samuel de Champlain. He was the Aeneas of a destined people, and in her womb lay the embryo life of Canada. De Monts, after his exclusive privilege of trade was revoked and his Acadian enterprise ruined, had, as we have seen, abandoned it to Poutrincourt. Perhaps it would have been well for him had he abandoned it with all transatlantic enterprises, but the passion for discovery and the noble ambition of founding colonies had taken possession of his mind. These, rather than a mere hope of gain, seem to have been his controlling motives. Yet the profits of the fur trade were vital to the new designs he was meditating, to meet the heavy outlay they demanded, and he solicited and obtained a fresh monopoly of the traffic for 1 year. Champlain was at the time in Paris, but his unquiet thoughts turned westward. He was enamored of the New World, whose rugged charms had seized his fancy and his heart, and as explorers of Arctic seas have pined in their repose for polar ice and snow, so did his restless thoughts revert to the fog-wrapped coasts, the piny odours of forests, the noise of waters, the sharp and piercing sunlight, so dear to his remembrance. He longed to unveil the mystery of that boundless wilderness, and plant the Catholic faith and the power of France amid its ancient barbarism. 5 years before, he had explored the St. Lawrence as far as the rapids above Montreal. Was the true site for a settlement, a fortified post, whence, as from a secure basis, the waters of the vast interior might be traced back towards their sources, and a westward route discovered to China and Japan. For the fur trade, too, the innumerable streams that descended to the great river might all be closed against foreign intrusion by a single ford at some commanding point, and made tributary to a rich and permanent commerce, while, and this was nearer to his heart, for he had often been heard to say that the saving of a soul was worth more than the conquest of an empire, countless savage tribes, in the bondage of Satan, might by the same avenues be reached and redeemed. De Mounts embraced his views, and fitting out 2 ships, gave command of one to the elder Pontgrave, of the other to Champlain. The former was to trade with the Indians and bring back the cargo of furs which, it was hoped, would meet the expense of the voyage. To Champlain fell the harder task of settlement and exploration. Pontgrave, laden with goods for the Indian trade of Tadoussac, sailed from Honfleur on the 5th of April, 1608. Champlain, with men, arms, and stores for the colony, followed 8 days later. On the 15th of May he was on the Grand Bank, on the 30th he passed Gaspé, and on the 3rd of June neared Tadoussac. No living thing was to be seen. He anchored, lowered a boat, and rowed into the port, round the rocky point at the southeast, then, from the fury of its winds and currents, called La Pente de tous les Diables. There was life enough within, and more than he cared to find. In the still anchorage under the cliffs lay Pontgrave's vessel, and at her side another ship, which proved to be a Basque fur trader. Pontgrave, arriving a few days before, had found himself anticipated by the Basques, who were busied in a brisk trade with bands of Indians cabined along the borders of the cove. He displayed the royal letters, and commanded a cessation of the prohibited traffic, but the Basques proved refractory, declared that they would trade in spite of the king, fired on Pontgrave with cannon and musketry, wounded him and 2 of his men, and killed a third. They then boarded his vessel, and carried away all his cannon, small arms, and ammunition, saying that they would restore them when they had finished their trade and were ready to return home. Champlain found his comrade on shore, in a disabled condition. The Basques, though still strong enough to make fight, were alarmed for the consequences of their conduct, and anxious to come to terms. A peace, therefore, was signed on board their vessel, all differences were referred to the judgment of the French courts, harmony was restored, and the choleric strangers betook themselves to catching whales. This port of Tadoussac was long the centre of the Canadian fur trade. A desolation of barren mountains closes round it, betwixt whose ribs of rugged granite, bristling with savins, birches, and firs, the Saguenay rolls its gloomy waters from the northern wilderness. Centuries of civilization have not tamed the wildness of the place, and still, in grim repose, the mountains hold their guard against the wave-like lake that glistens in their shadow, and doubles in its sullen mirror crag, precipice, and forest. Near the brink of the cove or harbour where the vessel lay, and a little below the mouth of a brook which formed one of the outlets of this small lake, stood the remains of the wooden barrack built by Chauvin 8 years before. Above the brook were the lodges of an Indian camp, stacks of poles covered with birch bark. They belonged to an Algonquin horde, called Montagnais, denizens of surrounding wilds, and gatherers of their only harvest, skins of the moose, caribou, and bear, fur of the beaver, marten, otter, fox, wild cat, and lynx. Nor was this all, for there were intermediate traders betwixt the French and the shivering bands who roamed the weary stretch of stunted forest between the headwaters of the Saguenay and Hudson's Bay. Indefatigable canoe-men, in their birchen vessels, light as eggshells, they threaded the devious tracks of countless rippling streams, shady byways of the forest, where the wild duck scarcely finds depth to swim, then descended to their mart along those scenes of picturesque yet dreary grandeur which steam has made familiar to modern tourists. With slowly moving paddles they glided beneath the cliff whose shaggy brows frown across the zenith, and whose base the deep waves wash with a hoarse and hollow cadence, and they passed the sepulchre bay of the Trinity, dark as the tide of Acheron, a sanctuary of solitude and silence, depths which, as the fable runs, no sounding line can fathom, and heights at whose dizzy verge the wheeling eagle seems a speck. Peace being established with the Basques, and the wounded Pontgrave busied, as far as might be, in transferring to the hold of his ship the rich lading of the Indian canoes, Champlain spread his sails, and again held his course up the St. Lawrence. Far to the south, in sun and shadow, slumbered the woody mountains whence fell the countless springs of the St. John, behind tenantless shores, now white with glimmering villages, La Cheniac, Granville, Kamouraska, St. Roch, St. Jean, Vincelat, Berthier. But on the north the jealous wilderness still asserts its sway, crowding to the river's verge its walls, domes, and towers of granite, and to this hour its solitude is scarcely broken. Above the point of the island of Orleans, a constriction of the vast channel narrows it to less than a mile, with the green heights of Point Levis on the one side, and on the other the cliffs of Quebec. Here a small stream, the St. Charles, enters the St. Lawrence, and in the angle betwixt them rises the promontory on 2 sides, a natural fortress. Between the cliffs and the river lay a strand covered with walnuts and other trees. From this strand, by a rough passage gullied downward from the place where Prescott Gate now guards the way, one might climb the height to the broken plateau above, now burdened with its ponderous load of churches, convents, dwellings, ramparts, and batteries. Thence, by a gradual ascent, the rock sloped upward to its highest summit, Cape Diamond, looking down on the St. Lawrence from a height of 350 feet. Here the citadel now stands. Then the fierce sun fell on the bald, baking rock, with its crisped mosses and parched lichens. 2 centuries and a half have quickened the solitude with swarming life, covered the deep bosom of the river with barge and steamer and gliding sail, and reared cities and villages on the side of forests, but nothing can destroy the surpassing grandeur of the scene. On the strand between the water and the cliffs Champlain's axemen fell to their work. They were pioneers of an advancing host, advancing, it is true, with feeble and uncertain progress, priests, soldiers, peasants, feudal scutcheons, royal insignia, not the Middle Age, but engendered of it by the stronger life of modern centralization, sharply stamped with a parental likeness, heir to parental weakness and parental force. In a few weeks a pile of wooden buildings rose on the brink of the St. Lawrence, on or near the site of the marketplace of the lower town of Quebec. The pencil of Champlain, always regardless of proportion and perspective, has preserved its likeness. A strong wooden wall, surmounted by a gallery loopholed for musketry, enclosed 3 buildings, containing quarters for himself and his men, together with a courtyard, from one side of which rose a tall dovecot, like a belfry. A moat surrounded the whole, and 2 or 3 small cannon were planted on salient platforms towards the river. There was a large storehouse near at hand, and a part of the adjacent ground was laid out as a garden. In this garden Champlain was one morning directing his labourers, when Tetu, his pilot, approached him with an anxious countenance, and muttered a request to speak with him in private. Champlain assenting, they withdrew to the neighbouring woods, when the pilot disburdened himself of his secret. One Antoine Natel, a locksmith, smitten by conscience or fear, had revealed to him a conspiracy to murder his commander and deliver Quebec into the hands of the Basques and Spaniards, then at Tadoussac. Another locksmith, named Duval, was author of the plot, and with the aid of 3 accomplices, had befooled or frightened nearly all the company into taking part of it. Each was assured that he should make his fortune; all were mutually pledged to poignard the first betrayer of the secret. The critical point of their enterprise was the killing of Champlain. Some were for strangling him, some for raising a false alarm in the night and shooting him as he came out from his quarters. Having heard the pilot's story, Champlain, remaining in the woods, desired his informant to find Antoine Natel, and bring him to the spot. Natel soon appeared, trembling with excitement and fear, and a close examination left no doubt of the truth of his statement. A small vessel, built by Pontgrave at Tadoussac, had lately arrived, and orders were now given that it should anchor close at hand. On board was a young man in whom confidence could be placed. Champlain sent him 2 bottles of wine, with a direction to tell the 4 ringleaders that they had been given him by his Basque friends at Tadoussac, and to invite them to share the good cheer. They came aboard in the evening, and were seized and secured. "Voilà donc mes galants bien estonnés," writes Champlain. It was 10 o'clock, and most of the men on shore were asleep. They were wakened suddenly, and told of the discovery of the plot and the arrest of the ringleaders. Pardon was then promised them, and they were dismissed again to their beds, greatly relieved, for they had lived in trepidation, each fearing the other. Duval's body, swinging from a gibbet, gave wholesome warning to those he had seduced, and his head was displayed on a pike, from the highest roof of the buildings, food for birds and a lesson to sedition. His 3 accomplices were carried by Pontgrave to France, where they made their atonement in the galleys. It was on the 18th of September that Pontgrave set sail, leaving Champlain and 28 men to hold Quebec through the winter. 3 weeks later, and shores and hills glowed with gay prognostics of approaching desolation: the yellow and scarlet of the maples, the deep purple of the ash, the garnet hue of young oaks, the crimson of the tupelo at the water's edge, and the golden plumage of birch saplings in fissures in the cliffs. It was a short-lived beauty. The forest dropped its festal robes. Shrivelled and faded, they rustled to the earth. The crystal air and laughing sun of October passed away, and November sank upon the shivering waste, chill and sombre as the tomb. A roving band of Montagnais had built their huts near the buildings, and were busying themselves with their autumnal eel fishery, on which they greatly relied to sustain their miserable lives through the winter. Their slimy harvest being gathered, and duly smoked and dried, they gave it for safe keeping to Champlain, and set out to hunt beavers. It was deep in the winter before they came back, reclaimed their eels, built their birch cabins again, and disposed themselves for a life of ease, until famine or their enemies should put an end to their enjoyments. These were by no means without alloy. While gorged with food, they lay dozing on piles of branches in their smoky huts, where, through the crevices of the thin birch bark, streamed in a cold capable of times at congealing mercury. Their slumbers were beset with nightmare visions of Iroquois forays, scalpings, butcherings, and burnings. As dreams were their oracles, the camp was wild with fright. They sent out no scouts and placed no guard, but with each repetition of these nocturnal terrors, they came flocking in a body to beg admission within the fort. The women and children were allowed to enter the yard and remain during the night, while anxious fathers and jealous husbands shivered in the darkness without. On one occasion, a group of wretched beings was seen on the farther bank of the St. Lawrence, like wild animals driven by famine to the borders of the settlers' clearing. The river was full of drifting ice, and there was no crossing without risk of life. The Indians, in their desperation, made the attempt, and midway their canoes were ground to atoms among the tossing masses. Agile as wildcats, they all leaped upon a huge raft of ice, the squaws carrying their children on their shoulders, a feat at which Champlain marvelled when he saw their starved and emaciated condition. Here they began a wail of despair, when happily the pressure of other masses thrust the sheet of ice against the northern shore. They landed, and soon made their appearance at the fort, worn to skeletons and horrible to look upon. The French gave them food, which they devoured with a frenzied avidity, and, unappeased, fell upon a dead dog left on the snow by Champlain for 2 months past as a bait for foxes. They broke this carrion into fragments, and thawed and devoured it, to the disgust of the spectators, who tried vainly to prevent them. This was but a severe access of the periodical famine which, during the winter, was a normal condition of the Algonquin tribes of Acadia and the lower St. Lawrence, who, unlike the cognate tribes of New England, never tilled the soil, or made any reasonable provision against the time of need. One would gladly know how the founders of Quebec spent the long hours of their first winter, but on this point the only man among them, perhaps, who could write, has not thought it necessary to enlarge. He himself beguiled his leisure with trapping foxes, or hanging a dead dog from a tree and watching the hungry martens in their efforts to reach it. Towards the close of winter, all found abundant employment in nursing themselves or their neighbours, for the inevitable scurvy broke out with a virulence. At the middle of May, only 8 men of the 28 were alive, and half of these were suffering from disease. This wintry purgatory wore away, the icy stalactites that hung from the cliffs fell crashing to the earth, the clamour of the wild geese was heard, the bluebirds appeared in the naked woods, the water willows were covered with their soft caterpillar-like blossoms, the twigs of the swamp maple were flushed with ruddy bloom, the ash hung out its black tufts, the shad bush seemed a wreath of snow, the white stars of the bloodroot gleamed among the dank fallen leaves, and in the young grass of the wet meadows the marsh marigolds shone like spots of gold. Great was the joy of Champlain when, on the 5th of June, he saw a sailboat rounding the Point of Orleans, betokening that spring had brought with it the longed-for succours. A son-in-law of Pontgrave, named Marais, was on board, and he reported that Pontgrave was then at Tadoussac, where he had lately arrived. Thither Champlain hastened, to take counsel with his comrade. His constitution or his courage had defied the scurvy. They met, and it was determined betwixt them, that while Pontgrave remained in charge of Quebec, Champlain should enter at once on his long-meditated explorations, by which, like La Salle 70 years later, he had good hope of finding a way to China. But there was a lion in the path. The Indian tribes, to whom peace was unknown, invested with their scalping parties the streams and pathways of the forest, and increased tenfold its inseparable risks. The after career of Champlain gives abundant proof that he was more than indifferent to all such chances, yet now an expedient for evading them offered itself, so consonant with his instincts that he was glad to accept it. During the last autumn a young chief from the banks of the then unknown Ottawa had been at Quebec, and, amazed at what he saw, he had begged Champlain to join him in the spring against his enemies. These enemies were a formidable race of savages, the Iroquois, or 5 confederate nations, who dwelt in fortified villages within limits now embraced by the state of New York, and who were a terror to all the surrounding forests. They were deadly foes of their kindred the Hurons, who dwelt on the lake which bears their name, and were allies of Algonquin bands on the Ottawa. All alike were tillers of the soil, living at ease when compared with the famished Algonquins of the lower St. Lawrence. By joining these Hurons and Algonquins against their Iroquois enemies, Champlain might make himself the indispensable ally and leader of the tribes of Canada, and at the same time fight his way to discovery in regions which otherwise were barred against him. From first to last it was the policy of France and America to mingle in Indian politics, hold the balance of power between adverse tribes, and envelop in the network of her power and diplomacy the remotest hordes of the wilderness. Of this policy the father of New France may perhaps be held to have set a rash and premature example. Yet while he was apparently following the dictates of his own adventurous spirit, it became evident, a few years later, that under his thirst for discovery and spirit of knight errantry lay a consistent and deliberate purpose. That it had already assumed a definite shape is not likely, but his after course makes it plain that, in embroiling himself and his colony with the most formidable savages on the continent, he was by no means acting so recklessly as at first sight would appear. Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part 2, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pioneers of France in the New World, by Francis Parkman. Part 2, Samuel Champlain and His Associates, Chapter 10, Lake Champlain, 1609. It was past the middle of June, and the expected warriors from the upper country had not come, a delay which seems to have given Champlain little concern, for without waiting longer, he set out with no better allies than a band of Montagnais. But as he moved up the St. Lawrence, he saw, thickly clustered in the bordering forest, the lodges of an Indian camp, and, landing, found his Huron and Algonquin allies. Few of them had ever seen a white man, and they surrounded the steel-clad strangers in speechless wonder. Champlain asked for their chief, and the staring throng moved with him towards a lodge where sat, not one chief, but two, for each band had its own. There were feasting, smoking, and speeches, and the needful ceremony over, all descended together to Quebec, for the strangers were bent on seeing those wonders of architecture, the fame of which had pierced the recesses of their forests. On their arrival, they feasted their eyes and glutted their appetites, yelped consternation at the sharp explosions of the arquebus and the roar of the cannon, pitched their camps, and bedecked themselves for their war dance. In the still night, their fire glared against the black and jagged cliff, and the fierce red light fell on tawny limbs convulsed with frenzied gestures, and ferocious stampings on contorted visages, hideous with paint, on brandished weapons, on stone war-clubs, stone hatchets, and stone-pointed lances, while the drum kept up its hollow boom, and the air was split with mingled yells. The war-feast followed, and then all embarked together. Champlain was in a small shallop, carrying, besides himself, 11 men of Pontgrave's party, including his son-in-law Marais, and the pilot La Route. They were armed with the arquebus, a matchlock or firelock somewhat like the modern carbine, and, from its shortness, not ill suited for use in the forest. On the 28th of June they spread their sails and held their course against the current, while around them the river was alive with canoes, and hundreds of naked arms plied the paddle with a steady, measured sweep. They crossed the Lake of St. Peter, threaded the devious channels among its many islands, and reached at last the mouth of the Rivière des Iroquois, since called the Richelieu, or the St. Jean. Here, probably on the site of the town of Sorel, the leisurely warriors encamped for 2 days, hunted, fished, and took their ease, regaling their allies with venison and wildfowl. They quarrelled too. 3/4 of their number seceded, took to their canoes in dudgeon, and paddled towards their homes, while the rest pursued their course up the broad and placid stream. Walls of verdure stretched on left and right. Now aloft in the lonely air rose the cliffs of Balsieux, and now, before them, framed in circling forest, the basin of Chambly spread its tranquil mirror, glittering in the sun. The shallop outsailed the canoes. Champlain, leaving his allies behind, crossed the basin and tried to pursue his course, but as he listed in the stillness, the unwelcome noise of rapids reached his ear, and by glimpses through the dark foliage of the islets of St. John he could see the gleam of snowy foam and the flashing of hurrying waters. Leaving the boat by the shore in charge of 4 men, he went with Marais, La Route, and 5 others, to explore the wild before him. They pushed their way through the damps and shadows of the wood, through thickets and tangled vines, over mossy rocks and mouldering logs. Still the hoarse surging of the rapids followed them, and when, parting the screen of foliage, they looked out upon the river, they saw it thick set with rocks, where, plunging over ledges, gurgling under drift logs, darting along clefts, and boiling in chasms, the angry waters filled the solitude with monotonous ravings. Champlain retraced his steps. He had learned the value of an Indian's word. His allies had promised him that his boat could pass unobstructed throughout the whole journey. "It afflicted me," he says, "and troubled me exceedingly to be obliged to return without having seen so great a lake, full of fair islands and bordered with fine countries which they had described to me." When he reached the boat, he found the whole savage crew gathered at the spot. He mildly rebuked their bad faith, but added that though they had deceived him, he, as far as might be, would fulfil his pledge. To this end he directed Maret, with the boat and the greater part of the men, to return to Quebec, while he, with two who offered to follow him, should proceed in the Indian canoes. The warriors lifted their canoes from the water, and bore them on their shoulders half a league through the forest to the smoother stream above. Here the chiefs made a muster of their forces, counting 24 canoes and 60 warriors. All embarked again, and advanced once more, by marsh, meadow, forest, and scattered islands, then full of game, for it was an uninhabited land, the war-path and the battle-ground of hostile tribes. The warriors observed a certain system in their advance. Some were in front as a vanguard, others formed the main body, while an equal number were in the forests on the flanks and rear, hunting for the subsistence of the whole; for though they had a provision of parched maize pounded into meal, they kept it for use when, from the vicinity of the enemy, hunting should become impossible. Late in the day they landed and drew up their canoes, ranging them closely side by side. Some stripped sheets of bark, to cover their camp sheds; others gathered wood, the forest being full of dead, dry trees; others felled the living trees for a barricade. They seem to have had steel axes, obtained by barter from the French, for in less than 2 hours they had made a strong defensive work, in the form of a half circle, open on the river side, where their canoes lay on the strand, and large enough to enclose all their huts and sheds. Some of their number had gone forward as scouts, and returning reported no signs of an enemy. This was the extent of their precaution, for they placed no guard, but all, in full security, stretched themselves to sleep, a vicious custom from which the lazy warrior of the forest rarely departs. They had not forgotten, however, to consult their oracle. The medicine man pitched his magic lodge in the woods, formed of a small stack of poles, planted in a circle and brought together at the tops like stacked muskets. Over these he placed the filthy deerskins which served him for a robe, and, creeping in at a narrow opening, hid himself from view. Crouched in a ball upon the earth, he invoked the spirits in mumbling, inarticulate tones, while his naked auditory, squatted on the ground like apes, listened in wonder and awe. Suddenly the lodge moved, rocking with violence to and fro, by the power of the spirits, as the Indians thought, while Champlain could plainly see the tawny fist of the medicine man shaking the poles. They begged him to keep a watchful eye on the peak of the lodge, whence fire and smoke would presently issue, but with the best efforts of his vision, he discovered none. Meanwhile the medicine man was seized with such convulsions, that when his divination was over, his naked body streamed with perspiration. In loud, clear tones, and in an unknown tongue, he invoked the spirit, who was understood to be present in the form of a stone, and whose feeble and squeaking accents were heard at intervals, like the wail of a young puppy. In this manner they consulted the spirit, as Champlain thinks the devil, at all their camps. His replies for the most part seem to have given them great content, yet they took other measures, of which the military advantages were less questionable. The principal chief gathered bundles of sticks, and, without wasting his breath, struck them in the earth in a certain order, calling each by the name of some warrior, a few taller than the rest representing the subordinate chiefs. Thus was indicated the position which each was to hold in the expected battle. All gathered round and attentively studied the sticks, ranged like a child's wooden soldiers, or the pieces on a chessboard; then, with no further instruction, they formed their ranks, broke them, and reformed them again and again with excellent alacrity and skill. Again the canoes advanced, the river widening as they went. Great islands appeared, leagues in extent, Isle à la Motte, Long Island, Grand Isle, channels where ships might float and broad reaches of water stretched between them, and Champlain entered the lake which preserves his name to posterity. Cumberland Head was passed, and from the opening of the great channel between Grand Isle and the main he could look forth on the wilderness sea. Edged with woods, the tranquil flood spread southward beyond sight. Far on the left rose the forest ridges of the Green Mountains, and on the right the Adirondacks, haunts in these later years of amateur sportsmen from counting rooms or college halls. Then the Iroquois made them their hunting ground, and beyond, in the valleys of the Mohawk, the Onondaga, and the Genesee, stretched the long line of their 5 cantons and palisaded towns. At night they encamped again. The scene is a familiar one to many a tourist, and perhaps, standing at sunset on the peaceful strand, Champlain saw what a roving student of this generation has seen on those same shores at that same hour, the glow of the vanished sun behind the western mountains, darkly piled in mist and shadow along the sky; near at hand, the dead pine, mighty in decay, stretching its ragged arms athwart the burning heaven; the crow perched on its top like an image carved in jet; and aloft, the night hawk, circling in his flight, and with a strange whirring sound, diving through the air each moment for the insects he makes his prey. The progress of the party was becoming dangerous. They changed their mode of advance and moved only in the night. All day they lay close in the depth of the forest, sleeping, lounging, smoking tobacco of their own raising, and beguiling the hours, no doubt, with the shallow banter and obscene jesting with which knots of Indians are wont to amuse their leisure. At twilight they embarked again, paddling their cautious way till the eastern sky began to redden. Their goal was the rocky promontory where Fort Ticonderoga was long afterwards built. Thence they would pass the outlet of Lake George, and launch their canoes again on that Como of the wilderness, whose waters, limpid as a fountainhead, stretched far southward between their flanking mountains. Landing at the future site of Fort William Henry, they would carry their canoes through the forest to the river Hudson, and, descending it, attack perhaps some outlying town of the Mohawks. In the next century this chain of lakes and rivers became the grand highway of savage and civilized war, linked to memories of momentous conflicts. The Allies were spared so long a progress. On the morning of the 29th of July, after paddling all night, they hid as usual in the forest on the western shore, apparently between Crown Point and Ticonderoga. The warriors stretched themselves to their slumbers, and Champlain, after walking till 9 or 10 o'clock through the surrounding woods, returned to take his repose on a pile of spruce boughs. Sleeping, he dreamed a dream, wherein he beheld the Iroquois drowning in the lake, and, trying to rescue them, he was told by his Algonquin friends that they were good for nothing, and had better be left to their fate. For some time past he had been beset every morning by his superstitious allies, eager to learn about his dreams, and to this moment his unbroken slumbers had failed to furnish the desired prognostics. The announcement of this auspicious vision filled the crowd with joy, and at nightfall they embarked, flushed with anticipated victories. It was 10 o'clock in the evening, when near a projecting point of land, which was probably Ticonderoga, they descried dark objects in motion on the lake before them. These were a flotilla of Iroquois canoes, heavier and slower than theirs, for they were made of oak bark. Each party saw the other, and the mingled war cries pealed over the darkened water. The Iroquois, who were near the shore, having no stomach for an aquatic battle, landed, and, making night hideous with their clamours, began to barricade themselves. Champlain could see them in the woods, labouring like beavers, hacking down trees with iron axes taken from the Canadian tribes in war, and with stone hatchets of their own making. The allies remained on the lake, a bow-shot from the hostile barricade, their canoes made fast together by poles lashed across. All night they danced with as much vigour as the frailty of their vessels would permit, their throats making amends for the enforced restraint of their limbs. It was agreed on both sides that the fight should be deferred till daybreak, but meanwhile a commerce of abuse, sarcasm, menace, and boasting gave unceasing exercise to the lungs and fancy of the combatants, much, says Champlain, like the besiegers and besieged in a beleaguered town. As day approached, he and his 2 followers put on the light armour of the time. Champlain wore the doublet and long hose then in vogue. Over the doublet he buckled on a breastplate, and probably a back-piece, while his thighs were protected by cuisses of steel, and his head by a plumed casque. Across his shoulder hung the strap of his bandolier, or ammunition box, at his side with his sword, and in his hand his arquebuse. Such was the equipment of this ancient Indian fighter, whose exploits date 11 years before the landing of the Puritans at Plymouth, and 66 years before King Philip's War. Each of the 3 Frenchmen was in a separate canoe, and as it grew light, they kept themselves hidden, either by lying at the bottom or covering themselves with an Indian robe. The canoes approached the shore, and all landed without opposition at some distance from the Iroquois, whom they presently could see filing out of their barricade, tall, strong men, some 200 in number, the boldest and fiercest warriors of North America. They advanced through the forest with a steadiness which excited the admiration of Champlain. Among them could be seen 3 chiefs, made conspicuous by their tall plumes. Some bore shields of wood and hide, and some were covered with a kind of armour made of rough twigs interlaced with a vegetable fibre supposed by Champlain to be cotton. The allies, growing anxious, called with loud cries for their champion, and opened their ranks that he might pass to the front. He did so, and advancing before his red companions in arms, stood revealed to the gaze of the Iroquois, who, beholding the warlike apparition in their path, stared in mute amazement. "I looked at them," says Champlain, "and they looked at me. When I saw them getting ready to shoot their arrows at us, I levelled my arquebuse, which I had loaded with 4 balls, and aimed straight at one of the 3 chiefs. The shot brought down 2, and wounded another. On this our Indians set up such a yelling that one could not have heard a thunderclap, and all the while the arrows flew thick on both sides. The Iroquois were greatly astonished and frightened to see 2 of their men killed so quickly, in spite of their arrow-proof armour. As I was reloading, one of my companions fired a shot from the woods, which so increased their astonishment that, seeing their chiefs dead, they abandoned the field and fled into the depth of the forest. The allies dashed after them. Some of the Iroquois were killed, and more were taken. Camp, canoes, provisions, all were abandoned, and many weapons flung down in the panic flight. The victory was complete. At night the victors led out one of the prisoners, told him that he was to die by fire, and ordered him to sing his death song if he dared. Then they began the torture, and presently scalped their victim alive, when Champlain, sickening at the sight, begged leave to shoot him. They refused, and he turned away in anger and disgust, on which they called him back and told him to do as he pleased. He turned again, and a shot from his arquebuse put the wretch out of misery. The scene filled him with horror, but a few months later, on the Place de la Grève at Paris, he might have witnessed tortures equally revolting and equally vindictive, inflicted on the regicide Ravaillac by the sentence of grave and learned judges. The allies made a prompt retreat from the scene of their triumph. 3 or 4 days brought them to the mouth of the Richelieu. Here they separated. The Hurons and Algonquins made for Ottawa, their homeward route, each with a share of prisoners for future torments. At parting, they invited Champlain to visit their towns and aid them again in their wars, an invitation which this paladin of the woods failed not to accept. The companions now remaining to him were the Montagnais. In their camp on the Richelieu, one of them dreamed that a war party of Iroquois was close upon them, on which, in a torrent of rain, they left their huts, paddled in dismay to the islands above the lake of St. Peter, and hid themselves all night in the rushes. In the morning they took heart, emerged from their hiding places, descended on Quebec, and went thence to Tadoussac, whither Champlain accompanied them. Here the squaws, stark naked, swam out to the canoes to receive the heads of the dead Iroquois, and, hanging them from their necks, danced in triumph along the shore. One of the heads and a pair of arms were then bestowed on Champlain, touching memorials of gratitude, which, however, he was by no means to keep for himself, but to present to the king. Thus did New France rush into collision with the redoubted warriors of the Five Nations. Here was the beginning, and in some measure doubtless the cause, of a long suite of murderous conflicts, bearing havoc and flame to generations yet unborn. Champlain had invaded the tiger's den, and now, in smothered fury, the patient savage would lie biding his day of blood. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part 2, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman. Part 2, Samuel Champlain and His Associates. Chapter 11, War, Trade, Discovery, 1610 to 1612. Champlain and Pontgrave returned to France, while Pierre Chauvin of Dieppe held Quebec in their absence. The king was at Fontainebleau. It was a few months before his assassination, and here Champlain recounted his adventures, to the great satisfaction of the lively monarch. He gave him also, not the head of the dead Iroquois, but a belt wrought in embroidery of dyed quills of the Canada porcupine, together with 2 small birds of scarlet plumage, and the skull of a garfish. De Monts was at court, striving for a renewal of his monopoly. His efforts failed, on which, with great spirit but little discretion, he resolved to push his enterprise without it. Early in the spring of 1610 the ship was ready, and Champlain and Pontgrave were on board, when a violent illness seized the former, reducing him to the most miserable of all conflicts, the battle of the eager spirit against the treacherous and failing flesh. Having partially recovered, he put to sea, giddy and weak, in wretched plight for the hard career of toil and battle which the New World offered him. The voyage was prosperous, no other mishap occurring than that of an ardent youth of St. Malo, who drank the health of Pontgrave with such persistent enthusiasm that he fell overboard and was drowned. There were ships at Tadoussac, fast loading with furs, and boats, too, higher up the river, anticipating the trade, and draining De Monts's resources in advance. Champlain, who was left free to fight and explore wherever he should see fit, had provided, to use his own phrase, 2 strings to his bow. On the one hand, the Montagnais had promised to guide him northward to Hudson's Bay; on the other, the Hurons were to show him the Great Lakes, with the mines of copper on their shores; and to each the same reward was promised, to join them against the common foe, the Iroquois. The rendezvous was at the mouth of the river Richelieu. Thither the Hurons were to descend in force, together with Algonquins of the Ottawa, and thither Champlain now repaired, while around his boat swarmed a multitude of Montagnais canoes, filled with warriors whose lank hair streamed loose in the wind. There is an island in the St. Lawrence near the mouth of the Richelieu. On the 19th of June it was swarming with busy and clamorous savages. Champlain's Montagnais allies, cutting down the trees and clearing the ground for a dance and a feast, for they were hourly expecting the Algonquin warriors, and were eager to welcome them with befitting honours. But suddenly, far out on the river, they saw an advancing canoe. Now on this side, now on that, the flashing paddles urged it forward as if death were on its track, and as it drew near, the Indians on board cried out that the Algonquins were in a forest, a league distant, engaged with 100 warriors of the Iroquois, who, outnumbered, were fighting savagely within a barricade of trees. The air was split with shrill outcries. The Montagnais snatched their weapons, shields, bows, arrows, war-clubs, sword-blades made fast to poles, and ran headlong to their canoes, impeding each other in their haste, screeching to Champlain to follow, and invoking with no less vehemence the aid of certain fur traders, just arrived on 4 boats from below. These, as it was not their cue to fight, lent them a deaf ear, on which, in disgust and scorn, they paddled off, calling to the recusants that they were women, fit for nothing but to make war on beaver skins. Champlain and 4 of his men were in the canoes. They shot across the intervening water, and as their prows grated on the pebbles, each warrior flung down his paddle, snatched his weapons, and ran into the woods. The 5 Frenchmen followed, striving vainly to keep pace with the naked, light-limbed rabble, bounding like shadows through the forest. They quickly disappeared. Even their shrill cries grew faint, till Champlain and his men, discomforted and vexed, found themselves deserted in the midst of a swamp. The day was sultry, the forest air heavy, close, and filled with hosts of mosquitoes, so thick, says the chief sufferer, that we could scarcely draw breath, and it was wonderful how cruelly they persecuted us. Through black mud, spongy moss, water knee-deep, over fallen trees, among slimy logs and entangling roots, tripped by vines, lashed by recoiling boughs, panting under their steel headpieces and heavy corselets, the Frenchmen struggled on, bewildered and indignant. At length they descried 2 Indians running in the distance, and shouted to them in desperation that if they wanted their aid they must guide them to the enemy. At length they could hear the yells of the combatants. There was light in the forest before them, and they issued into a partial clearing made by the Iroquois axemen near the river. Champlain saw their barricade. Trees were piled into a circular breastwork, trunk, boughs, and matted foliage forming a strong defence, within which the Iroquois stood savagely at bay. Around them flocked the allies, half hidden in the edges of the forest, like hounds around a wild boar, eager, clamorous, yet afraid to rush in. They had attacked and had met a bloody rebuff. All their hope was now in the French, and when they saw them, a yell arose from hundreds of throats that outdid the wilderness voices whence its tones were borrowed, the whoop of the horned owl, the scream of the cougar, the howl of starved wolves on a winter night. A fierce response pealed from the desperate band within, and amid a storm of arrows from both sides, the Frenchmen threw themselves into the fray, firing at random through the fence of trunks, boughs, and drooping leaves, with which the Iroquois had encircled themselves. Champlain felt a stone-headed arrow splitting his ear and tearing through the muscles of his neck. He drew it out, and the moment after did a similar office for one of his men. But the Iroquois had not recovered from their first terror at the arquebuse, and when the mysterious and terrible assailants, clad in steel and armed with thunderbolts, ran up to the barricade, thrust their pieces through the openings, and shot death among the crowd within, they could not control their fright, but with every report threw themselves flat on the ground. Animated with unwonted valour, the allies, covered by their large shields, began to drag out the felled trees of the barricade, while others, under Champlain's direction, gathered at the edge of the forest, preparing to close the affair with a final rush. New actors soon appeared on the scene. These were a boat's crew of the fur traders under a young man of St. Malo, one Des Prairies, who, when he heard the firing, could not resist the impulse to join the fight. On seeing them, Champlain checked the assault, in order, as he says, that the newcomers might have their share in the sport. The traders opened fire, with great zest and no less execution, while the Iroquois, now wild with terror, leaped and writhed to dodge the shot which tore through their frail armour of twigs. Champlain gave the signal, the crowd ran to the barricade, dragged down the boughs or clambered over them, and bore themselves, in his own words, so well and manfully, that though scratched and torn by the sharp points, they quickly forced an entrance. The French ceased their fire, and, followed by a smaller body of Indians, scaled the barricade on the farther side. Now, amid howlings, shouts, and screeches, the work was finished. Some of the Iroquois were cut down as they stood, hewing with their war-clubs, and foaming like slaughtered tigers. Some climbed the barrier and were killed by the furious crowd without. Some were drowned in the river, while 15, the only survivors, were made prisoners. "By the grace of God," writes Champlain, "behold, the battle won." Drunk with ferocious ecstasy, the conquerors scalped the dead and gathered faggots for the living, while some of the fur traders, too late to bear part in the fight, robbed the carcasses of their blood-bedrenched robes of beaver skin amid the derision of the surrounding Indians. That night the torture fires blazed along the shore. Champlain saved one prisoner from their clutches, but nothing could save the rest. One body was quartered and eaten. As for the rest of the prisoners, says Champlain, they were kept to be put to death by the women and the girls, who in this respect are no less inhuman than the men, and indeed much more so, for by their subtlety they invent more cruel tortures, and take pleasure in it. On the next day a large band of Hurons appeared at the rendezvous, greatly vexed that they had come too late. The shores were thickly studded with Indian huts, and the woods were full of them. Here were warriors of 3 designations, including many subordinate tribes and representing 3 grades of savage society: the Hurons, the Algonquins of the Ottawa, and the Montagnais, afterwards styled by a Franciscan friar, than whom few men better knew them, the nobles, the burghers, and the peasantry and paupers of the forest. Many of them, from the remote interior, had never before seen a white man, and, wrapped like statues in their robes, they stood gazing on the French with a fixed stare of wild and wondering eyes. Judged by the standard of Indian war, a heavy blow had been struck on the common enemy. Here were hundreds of assembled warriors, yet none thought of following up their success. Elated with unexpected fortune, they danced and sang, then loaded their canoes, hung their scalps on poles, broke up their camps, and set out triumphant for their homes. Champlain had fought their battles, and now might claim, on their part, guidance and escort to the distant interior. Why he did not do so is scarcely apparent. There were cares, it seems, connected with the very life of his puny colony, which demanded his return to France. nor were his anxieties lessened by the arrival of a ship from his native town of Bruges, with tidings of the king's assassination. Here was a death blow to all that had remained of De Monts' credit at court, while that unfortunate nobleman, like his old associate, Poutrincourt, was moving with swift strides toward financial ruin. With the revocation of his monopoly, fur traders had swarmed to the St. Lawrence. Tadoussac was full of them, and for that year the trade was spoiled. Far from aiding to support a burdensome enterprise of colonization, it was in itself an occasion of heavy loss. Champlain bade farewell to his garden at Quebec, where maize, wheat, rye, and barley, with vegetables of all kinds, and a small vineyard of native grapes, for he was a zealous horticulturalist, held forth a promise which he was not to see fulfilled. He left one Du Parc in command, with 16 men, and sailing on the 8th of August, arrived at Honfleur with no worse accident than that of running over a sleeping whale near the Grand Bank. With the opening spring he was afloat again. Perils awaited him worse than those of Iroquois tomahawks, for approaching Newfoundland, the ship was entangled for days among drifting fields and bergs of ice. Escaping at length, she arrived at Tadoussac on the 13th of May, 1611. She had anticipated the spring. Forests and mountains, far and near, were all white with snow. A principal object with Champlain was to establish such relations with the great Indian communities of the interior as to secure to De Monts and his associates the advantage of trade with them, and to this end he now repaired to Montreal, a position in the gateway, as it were, of their yearly descents of trade or war. On arriving, he began to survey the ground for the site of a permanent post. A few days convinced him that under the present system all his efforts would be vain. Wild reports of the wonders of New France had gone abroad, and a crowd of hungry adventurers had hastened to the land of promise, eager to grow rich, they scarcely knew how, and soon to return disgusted. A fleet of boats and small vessels followed in Champlain's wake. Within a few days 13 of them arrived at Montreal, and more soon appeared. He was to break the ground, others would reap the harvest. Travel, discovery, and battle, all must inure to the profit, not of the colony, but to a crew of greedy traders. Champlain, however, chose the site, and cleared the ground for his intended post. It was immediately above a small stream, now running under arches of masonry, and entering the St. Lawrence at Point Callier, within the modern city. He called it Place Royale, and here, on the margin of the river, he built a wall of bricks made on the spot, in order to measure the destructive effects of the ice shove in the spring. Now, down the surges of St. Louis, where the mighty floods of the St. Lawrence, contracted to a narrow throat, roll in fury among their sunken rocks, here, through foam and spray and the roar of the angry torrent, a fleet of birch canoes came dancing like dry leaves on the froth of some riotous brook. They bore a band of Hurons first at the rendezvous. As they drew near the landing, all the fur traders' boats blazed out a clattering fusillade, which was designed to bid them welcome, but in fact terrified many of them to such a degree that they scarcely dared to come ashore. Nor were they reassured by the bearing of the disorderly crowd, who, in jealous competition for their beaver skins, left them not a moment's peace, and outraged all their notions of decorum. More soon appeared, till hundreds of warriors were encamped along the shore, all restless, suspicious, and alarmed. Late one night they awakened Champlain. On going with them to their camp, he found chiefs and warriors in solemn conclave around the glimmering firelight. Though they were fearful of the rest, their trust in him was boundless. "Come to our country, buy our beaver, build a fort, teach us the true faith, do what you will, but do not bring this crowd with you." The idea had seized them that these lawless bands of rival traders, all well armed, meant to plunder and kill them. Champlain assured them of safety, and the whole night was consumed in friendly colloquy. Soon afterward, however, the camp broke up, and the uneasy warriors removed to the borders of the Lake of St. Louis, placing the rapids betwixt themselves and the objects of their alarm. Here Champlain visited them, and hence these intrepid canoemen, kneeling in their birchen egg-shells, carried him homeward down the rapids, somewhat, as he admits, to the discomposure of his nerves. The great gathering dispersed. The traders descended to Tadoussac, and Champlain to Quebec, while the Indians went, some to their homes, some to fight the Iroquois. A few months later, Champlain was in close conference with de Monts at Pond, a place near Rochelle, of which the latter was governor. The last 2 years had made it apparent that, to keep the colony alive and maintain a basis for those discoveries on which his heart was bent, was impossible without a change of system. De Monts, engrossed with the cares of his government, placed all in the hands of his associate, and Champlain, fully empowered to act as he should judge expedient, set out for Paris. On the way, fortune, at one stroke, well nigh crushed him and New France together, for his horse fell on him, and he narrowly escaped with life. When he was partially recovered, he resumed his journey, pondering on means of rescue for the fading colony. A powerful protector must be had, a great name to shield the enterprise from assaults and intrigues of jealous rival interests. On reaching Paris he addressed himself to a prince of the blood, Charles de Bourbon, Comte de Soissons, described New France, its resources and its boundless extent, urged the need of unfolding a mystery pregnant, perhaps, with results of the deepest moment, laid before him maps and memoirs, and begged him to become the guardian of this new world. The royal consent being obtained, the Comte de Soissons became lieutenant general for the king in New France, with vice-regal powers. These in turn he conferred upon Champlain, making him his lieutenant, with full control over the trade in furs at and above Quebec, and with power to associate with himself such persons as he saw fit, to aid in the exploration and settlement of the country. Scarcely was the commission drawn when the Comte de Soissons, attacked with fever, died, to the joy of the Breton and Norman traders, whose jubilation, however, found a speedy end. Henri de Bourbon, Prince de Condé, first Prince of the Blood, assumed the vacant protectorship. He was a grandson of the gay and gallant Condé of the Civil Wars, was father of the great Condé, the youthful victor of Rocroi, and was husband of Charlotte de Montmorency, whose blonde beauties had fired the inflammable heart of Henry IV. To the unspeakable wrath of that keen lover, the prudent Condé fled with his bride, first to Brussels, and then to Italy, nor did he return to France till the regicide's knife had put his jealous fears to rest. After his return, he began to intrigue against the court. He was a man of common abilities, greedy of money and power, and scarcely seeking even the decency of a pretext to cover his mean ambition. His chief honour, an honour somewhat equivocal, is, as Voltaire observes, to have been father of the great Condé. Busy with his intrigues, he cared little for colonies and discoveries, and his rank and power were his sole qualifications for his new post. In Champlain alone was the life of New France. By instinct and temperament he was more impelled to the adventurous toils of exploration than to the duller task of building colonies. The profits of trade had value in his eyes only as a means to these ends, and settlements were important chiefly as a base of discovery. Two great objects eclipsed all others: to find a route to the Indies, and to bring the heathen tribes into the embraces of the Church, since, while he cared little for their bodies, his solicitude for their souls knew no bounds. It was no part of his plan to establish an odious monopoly. He sought rather to enlist the rival traders in his cause, and he now, in concurrence with de Monts, invited them to become sharers in the traffic, under certain regulations, and on condition of aiding in the establishment and support of the colony. The merchants of St Malo and Rouen accepted the terms, and became members of the new company, but the intractable heretics of Rochelle, refractory in commerce as in religion, kept aloof, and preferred the chances of an illicit trade. The prospects of New France were far from flattering, for little could be hoped from this unwilling league of selfish traders, each jealous of the rest. They gave the Prince of Condé large gratuities to secure his countenance and support. The hungry viceroy took them, and with these emoluments his interest in the colony ended. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part 2, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman. Part 2, Samuel Champlain and His Associates, Chapter 12. The Impostor Vignau. 1612 to 1613. The arrangements just indicated were a work of time. In the summer of 1612, Champlain was forced to forego his yearly voyage to New France. Nor, even in the following spring, were his labours finished and the rival interests brought to harmony. Meanwhile, incidents occurred destined to have no small influence on his movements. 3 years before, after his second fight with the Iroquois, a young man of his company had boldly volunteered to join the Indians on their homeward journey, and winter among them. Champlain gladly assented, and the following summer the adventurer returned. Another young man, one Nicolas de Vignan, next offered himself, and he also, embarking in the Algonquin canoes, passed up the Ottawa, and was seen no more for a twelvemonth. In 1612 he reappeared in Paris, bringing a tale of wonders, for, says Champlain, he was the most impudent liar that has been seen for many a day. He averred that at the sources of the Ottawa he found a great lake, that he had crossed it, and discovered a river flowing northward, that he had descended this river, and reached the shores of the sea, that here he had seen the wreck of an English ship, whose crew, escaping to land, had been killed by the Indians, and that this sea was distant from Montreal only 17 days by canoe. The clearness, consistency, and apparent simplicity of his story deceived Champlain, who had heard of a voyage of the English to the northern seas, coupled with rumours of his wreck and disaster, and was thus confirmed in his belief of Vignan's honesty. The Maréchal de Brissac, the President Jeannin, and other persons of eminence about the court, greatly interested by these dexterous fabrications, urged Champlain to follow up without delay a discovery which promised results so important, while he, with the Pacific, Japan, the Spice Islands, and India stretching in flattering vista before his fancy, entered with eagerness on the chase of this illusion. Early in the spring of 1613 the unwearied voyager crossed the Atlantic, and sailed up the St. Lawrence. On Monday, the 27th of May, he left the island of St. Helen, opposite Montreal, with 4 Frenchmen, one of whom was Nicolas de Vignan, and 1 Indian in 2 small canoes. They passed the swift current at St. Anne's, crossed the lake of 2 mountains, and advanced up the Ottawa till the rapids of Carillon and the Long Sault checked their course. So dense and tangled was the forest that they were forced to remain in the bed of the river, trailing their canoes along the bank with cords, or pushing them by main force up the current. Champlain's foot slipped; he fell in the rapids, 2 boulders, against which he braced himself, saving him from being swept down, while the cord of the canoe, twisted round his hand, nearly severed it. At length they reached smoother water, and presently met 15 canoes of friendly Indians. Champlain gave them the most awkward of his Frenchmen, and took one of their number in return, and exchanged greatly to his profit. All day they plied their paddles, and when night came they made their camp fire in the forest. He who now, when 2 centuries and a half are past, would see the evening bivouac of Champlain, has but to encamp, with Indian guides, on the upper waters of this same Ottawa, or on the borders of some lonely river of New Brunswick or of Maine. Day dawned. The east glowed with tranquil fire, that pierced with eyes of flame the fir trees, whose jagged tops stood drawn in black against the burning heaven. Beneath, the glossy river slept in shadow, or spread far and wide in sheets of burnished bronze, and the white moon, paling in the face of day, hung like a disk of silver in the western sky. Now a fervid light touched the dead tops of the hemlock, and creeping downward bathed the mossy beard of the patriarchal cedar, unstirred in the breathless air; now a fiercer spark beamed from the east, and now, half risen on the sight, a dome of crimson fire; the sun blazed with floods of radiance across the awakened wilderness. The canoes were launched again, and the voyagers held their course. Soon the still surface was flecked with spots of foam; islets of froth floated by, tokens of some great convulsion. Then, on their left, the falling curtain of the Rideau shone like a silver betwixt its bordering woods, and in front, white as a snowdrift, the cataracts of the Chaudière barred their way. They saw the unbridled river careering down its sheeted rocks, foaming in unfathomed chasms, wearying the solitude with the hoarse outcry of its agony and rage. On the brink of the rocky basin, where a plunging torrent boiled like a cauldron, and puffs of spray sprang out from its concussion like smoke from the throat of a cannon, Champlain's 2 Indians took their stand, and with a loud invocation threw tobacco into the foam, an offering to the local spirit, the Manitou of the cataract. They shouldered their canoes over the rocks, and through the woods, then launched them again, and with toil and struggle made their amphibious way, pushing, dragging, lifting, paddling, shoving with poles, till, when the evening sun poured its level rays across the quiet lake of Chaudiere, they landed, and made their camp on the verge of a woody island. Day by day brought a renewal of their toils. Hour by hour, they moved prosperously up the long windings of the solitary stream, and then, in quick succession, rapid followed rapid, till the bed of the Ottawa seemed a slope of foam. Now, like a wall bristling at the top with woody islets, the falls of the Chats faced them with the sheer plunge of their 16 cataracts. Now they glided beneath overhanging cliffs, where, seeing but unseen, the crouched wildcat eyed them from the thicket, now through the maze of water-girded rocks, which the white cedar and the spruce clasped with serpent-like roots, or among islands where old hemlocks darkened the water with deep green shadow. Here, too, the rock maple reared its verdant masses, the beech its glistening leaves and clean, smooth stem, and behind, stiff and sombre, rose the balsam fir. Here, in the tortuous channels, the muskrat swam and plunged, and the splashing wild duck dived beneath the alders or among the red and matted roots of thirsty water-willows. Aloft, the white pine towered above a sea of verdure. Old fir-trees, hoary and grim, shaggy with pendant mosses, leaned above the stream, and beneath, dead and submerged, some fallen oak thrust from the current its bare, bleached limbs, like the skeleton of a drowned giant. In the weedy cove stood the moose, neck-deep in water to escape the flies, wading shoreward, with glistening sides, as the canoes drew near, shaking his broad antlers and writhing his hideous nostril, as with clumsy trot he vanished in the woods. In these ancient wilds, to whose ever-verdant antiquity the pyramids are young, and Nineveh a mushroom of yesterday, where the sage wanderer of Odyssey, could he have urged his pilgrimage so far, would have surveyed the same grand and stern monotony, the same dark sweep of melancholy woods, here, while New England was a solitude, and the settlers of Virginia scarcely dared venture inland beyond the sound of a cannon-shot, Champlain was planting on shores and islands the emblems of his faith. Of the pioneers of the North American forests, his name stands foremost on the list. It was he who struck the deepest and boldest strokes into the heart of their pristine barbarism. At Chantilly, at Fontainebleau, Paris, in the cabinets of princes and of royalty itself, mingling with the proud vanities of the court, then lost from sight in the depths of Canada, the companion of savages, sharer of their toils, privations, and battles, more hardy, patient, and bold than they. Such for successive years were the alternations of this man's life. To follow on his trail once more. His Indians said that the rapids of the river above were impassable. Nicolas de Vignan affirmed the contrary, but from the first Vignan had been found always in the wrong. His aim seems to have been to involve his leader in difficulties, and disgust him with a journey which must soon result in exposing the imposture which had occasioned it. Champlain took counsel of the Indians. The party left the river and entered the forest. "We had a hard march," says Champlain. "I carried for my share of the luggage 3 arquebuses, 3 paddles, my overcoat, and a few bagatelles. My men carried a little more than I did, and suffered more from the mosquitoes than from their loads. After we had passed 4 small ponds, and advanced 2 leagues and a half, we were so tired that we could go no farther, having eaten nothing but a little roasted fish for nearly 24 hours. So we stopped in a pleasant place enough by the edge of a pond, and lighted a fire to drive off the mosquitoes, which plagued us beyond all description, and at the same time we set our nets to catch a few fish." On the next day they fared still worse, for their way was through a pine forest where a tornado had passed, tearing up the trees and piling one upon another in a vast windfall, where boughs, roots, and trunks were mixed in confusion. Sometimes they climbed over and sometimes crawled through these formidable barricades, till, after an exhausting march, they reached the banks of Muskrat Lake, by the edge of which was an Indian settlement. This neighborhood was the seat of the principal Indian population of the river, and as the canoes advanced, unwonted signs of human life could be seen on the borders of the lake. Here was a rough clearing. The trees had been burned. There was a rude and desolate gap in the sombre green of the pine forest. Dead trunks, blasted and black with fire, stood grimly upright amid the charred stumps and prostrate bodies of comrades half consumed. In the intervening spaces, the soil had been feebly scratched with hoes of wood or bone, and a crop of maize was growing, now some 4 inches high. The dwellings of these slovenly farmers, framed of poles covered with sheets of bark, were scattered here and there, singly or in groups, while their tenants were running to the shore in amazement. The chief, Nabakis, offered the calumet, then harangued the crowd: "These white men must have fallen from the clouds. How else could they have reached us through the woods and rapids which even we find it hard to pass? The French chief can do anything. All that we have heard of him must be true." And they hastened to regale the hungry visitors with a repast of fish. Champlain asked for guidance to the settlements above. It was readily granted. Escorted by his friendly hosts, he advanced beyond the foot of Muskrat Lake, and landing, saw the unaccustomed sight of pathways through the forest. They led to the clearings and cabins of a chief named Tessonat, who, amazed at the apparition of the white strangers, exclaimed that he must be in a dream. Next the voyagers crossed to the neighboring island, then deeply wooded with pine, elm, and oak. Here were more desolate clearings, more rude cornfields and bark-built cabins. Here too was a cemetery, which excited the wonder of Champlain, for the dead were better cared for than the living. Each grave was covered with a double row of pieces of wood, inclined like a roof till they crossed at the ridge, along which was laid a thick tablet of wood, meant apparently either to bind the whole together or to protect it from rain. At one end stood an upright tablet, or flattened post, rudely carved with an intended representation of the features of the deceased. If a chief, the head was adorned with a plume. If a warrior, there were figures near it of a shield, a lance, a war club, and a bow and arrows. If a boy, of a small bow and 1 arrow, and if a woman or girl, of a kettle, an earthen pot, a wooden spoon, and a paddle. The whole was decorated with red and yellow paint, and beneath slept the departed, wrapped in a skin of robes, his earthly treasures about him, ready for use in the land of souls. Tessonat was to give a tabagi, or solemn feast, in honor of Champlain, and the chiefs and elders of the island were invited. Runners were sent to summon the guests from neighboring hamlets, and on the morrow Tessonat's squaws swept his cabin for the festivity. Then Champlain and his Frenchmen were seated on skins in the place of honor, and the naked guests appeared in quick succession, each with his wooden dish and spoon, and each ejaculating his guttural salute as he stooped at the low door. The spacious cabin was full. The congregated wisdom and prowess of the nation sat expectant on the bare earth. Each long, bare arm thrust forth its dish in turn, as the host served out the banquet, in which, as courtesy enjoined, he himself was to have no share. First, a mess of pounded maize, in which were boiled, without salt, morsels of fish and dark scraps of meat. Then, fish and flesh broiled on the embers, with a kettle of cold water from the river. Champlain, in wise distrust of Ottawa cookery, confined himself to the simpler and less doubtful viands. A few minutes, and all alike had vanished. The kettles were empty. Then pipes were filled, and touched with fire brought in by the squaws, while the young men who had stood thronged about the entrance now modestly withdrew, and the door was closed for council. First the pipes were passed to Champlain. Then for a full half an hour the assembly smoked in silence. At length, when the fitting time was come, he addressed them in a speech in which he declared that, moved by affection for them, he visited their country to see its richness and its beauty, and to aid them in their wars, and he now begged them to furnish him with 4 canoes and 8 men, to convey him to the country of the Nipissings, a tribe dwelling northward on the lake which bears their name. His audience looked grave, for they were but cold and jealous friends of the Nipissings. For a time they discoursed in murmuring tones among themselves, all smoking meanwhile with redoubled vigor. Then Tessonat, chief of these forest republicans, rose and spoke in behalf of all. "We always knew you for our best friend among the Frenchmen. We love you like our own children. But why did you break your word with us last year, when we all went down to meet you at Montreal, to give you presents and go with you to war? You were not there, but other Frenchmen were there who abused us. We will never go again. As for the 4 canoes, you shall have them if you insist upon it, but it grieves us to think of the hardships you must endure. The Nipissings have weak hearts. They are good for nothing in war, but they kill us with charms, and they poison us. Therefore we are on bad terms with them. they will kill you too." Such was the pith of Tessonat's discourse, and at each clause the conclave responded in unison with an approving grunt. Champlain urged his petition, sought to relieve their tender scruples in his behalf, assured them that he was charm-proof, and that he feared no hardships. At length he gained his point. The canoes and men were promised, and seeing himself, as he thought, on the highway to his phantom North Sea, he left his entertainers to their pipes, and with a light heart issued from the close and smoky den to breathe the fresh air of the afternoon. He visited the Indian fields, with their young crops of pumpkins, beans, and French peas, the last of novelty obtained from the traders. Here Thomas, the interpreter, soon joined him with a countenance of ill news. In the absence of Champlain, the assembly had reconsidered their consent. The canoes were denied. With a troubled mind, he hastened again to the hall of council, and addressed the naked Senate in terms better suited to his exigencies than to their dignity. "I thought you were men. I thought you would hold fast to your word. But I find you children, without truth. You call yourselves my friends, yet you break faith with me. Still, I would not incommode you, and if you cannot give me 4 canoes, 2 will serve." The burden of the reply was, rocks, cataracts, and the wickedness of the Nipissings. "We will not give you the canoes, because we are afraid of losing you," they said. "This young man," rejoined Champlain, pointing to Vignan, who sat by his side, "has been to their country, and did not find the road or the people so bad as you have said." "Nicholas," demanded Tessonat, "did you say that you have been to the Nipissings?" The impostor sat mute for a time, and then replied, "Yes, I've been there." Hereupon an outcry broke from the assembly, and they turned their eyes on him askance, as if, says Champlain, they would have torn and eaten him. "You are a liar," returned the unceremonious host. "You know very well that you slept here among my children every night, and got up again every morning, and if you ever went to the Nipissings, it must have been when you were asleep. How can you be so impudent as to lie to your chief, and so wicked as to risk his life among so many dangers? He ought to kill you with tortures worse than those with which we kill our enemies." Champlain urged him to reply, but he sat motionless and dumb. Then he led him from the cabin, and conjured him to declare if in truth he had seen this Sea of the North. Vignan with oaths affirmed that all he had said was true. Returning to the council, Champlain repeated the impostor's story, how he had seen the sea, the wreck of an English ship, the heads of 80 Englishmen, and an English boy, prisoner among the Indians. At this an outcry rose louder than before, and the Indians turned in ire upon Vignan. "You are a liar! Which way did you go? By what river? By what lakes? Who went with you?" Vignan had made a map of his travels, which Champlain now produced, desiring him to explain it to his questioners, but his assurance failed him, and he could not utter a word. Champlain was greatly agitated. His heart was in the enterprise; his reputation was in a measure at stake; and now, when he thought his triumph so near, he shrank from believing himself the sport of an impudent impostor. The council broke up, the Indians displeased and moody, and he on his part full of anxieties and doubts. "I called Vignan to me in presence of his companions," he says. "I told him that the time for deceiving me was ended, that he must tell me whether or not he had really seen the things he had told me of, that I had forgotten the past, but that if he continued to mislead me, I would have him hanged without mercy." Vignan pondered for a moment, then fell on his knees, owned his treachery, and begged for forgiveness. Champlain broke into a rage, and, unable, as he says, to endure the sight of him, ordered him from his presence, and sent the interpreter after him to make further examination. Vanity, the love of notoriety, and the hope of reward, seem to have been his inducements, for he had in fact spent a quiet winter in Tessonat's cabin, his nearest approach to the northern sea, and he had flattered himself that he might escape the necessity of guiding his commander to this pretended discovery. The Indians were somewhat exultant. "Why did you not listen to chiefs and warriors, instead of believing the lies of this fellow?" And they counselled Champlain to have him killed at once, adding, "Give him to us, and we promise you that he shall never lie again." No motive remaining for farther advance, the party set out on their return, attended by a fleet of 40 canoes bound to Montreal for trade. They passed the perilous rapids of the Calumet, and were one night encamped on an island, when an Indian, slumbering in an uneasy posture, was visited with a nightmare. He leaped up with a yell, screamed that somebody was killing him, and ran for refuge into the river. Instantly all his companions sprang to their feet, and, hearing in fancy the Iroquois war whoop, took to the water, splashing, diving, and wading up to their necks, in the blindness of their fright. Champlain and his Frenchmen, roused at the noise, snatched their weapons and looked in vain for an enemy. The panic-stricken warriors, reassured at length, waded crestfallen on shore, and the whole ended in a laugh. At the Chaudiere a contribution of tobacco was collected on a wooden platter, and after a solemn harangue was thrown to the guardian Manitou. On the 17th of June they approached Montreal, where the assembled traders greeted them with discharges of small arms and cannon. Here, among the rest, was Champlain's lieutenant Du Parc, with his men, who had amused their leisure with hunting, and were revelling in a sylvan abundance, while their baffled chief, with worry of mind, fatigue of body, and a Lenten diet of half-cooked fish, was grievously fallen away in flesh and strength. He kept his word with De Vignan, left the scoundrel unpunished, bade farewell to the Indians, and, promising to rejoin them the next year, embarked in one of the trading ships for France. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part 2, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman. Part 2, Samuel Champlain and His Associates. Chapter 13, Discovery of Lake Huron, 1615. In New France, spiritual and temporal interests were inseparably blended, and, as will hereafter appear, the conversion of the Indians was used as a means of commercial and political growth. But with the single-hearted founder of the colony, considerations of material advantage, though clearly recognized, were no less clearly subordinate. He would fain rescue from perdition a people living, as he says, like brute beasts, without faith, without law, without religion, without God. While the want of funds and the indifference of his merchant associates, who as yet did not fully see that their trade would find in the missions its surest ally, were threatening to wreck his benevolent schemes, he found a kindred spirit in his friend Hood, secretary to the king, and comptroller general of the salt works of Bronage. Near this town was a convent of Recollet friars, some of whom were well known to Huel. To them he addressed himself, and several of the brotherhood, inflamed, we are told, with charity, were eager to undertake the mission. But the Recollets, mendicants by profession, were as weak in resources as Champlain himself. He repaired to Paris, then filled with bishops, cardinals, and nobles, assembled for the States General. Responding to his appeal, they subscribed 1,500 livres for the purchase of vestments, candles, and ornaments for altars. The king gave letters patent in favor of the mission, and the pope gave it his formal authorization. By this instrument the papacy in the person of Paul V virtually repudiated the action of the papacy in the person of Alexander VI, who had proclaimed all America the exclusive property of Spain. The Recollets form a branch of the great Franciscan order, founded early in the 13th century by St. Francis of Assisi. Saint, hero, or madman, according to the point of view from which he is regarded, he belonged to an era of the Church when the tumult of invading heresies awakened in her defence a band of impassioned champions, widely different from the placid saints of an earlier age. He was very young when dreams and voices began to reveal to him his vocation, and kindle his high-wrought nature to sevenfold heat. Self-respect, natural affection, decency, became in his eyes but stumbling-blocks and snares. He robbed his father to build a church, and, like so many of the Roman Catholic saints, confounded filth with humility, exchanged clothes with beggars, and walked the streets of Assisi in rags amid the hootings of his townsmen. He vowed perpetual poverty and perpetual beggary, and, in token of his renunciation of the world, stripped himself naked before the Bishop of Assisi, and then begged of him in charity a peasant's mantle. Crowds gathered to his fervent and dramatic eloquence. His handful of disciples multiplied, till Europe became thickly dotted with their convents. At the end of the 18th century, the three orders of St. Francis numbered 115,000 friars, and 28,000 nuns. 4 popes, 45 cardinals, and 46 canonized martyrs were enrolled on their record, besides about 2,000 more who had shed their blood for the faith. Their missions embraced nearly all the known world, and in 1621 there were in Spanish America alone 500 Franciscan converts. In process of time the Franciscans had relaxed their ancient rigor, but much of their pristine spirit still subsisted in the Recollets, a reformed branch of the order, sometimes known as Franciscans of the Strict Observance. 4 of their number were named for the mission of New France: Denis Jamet, Jean d'Olbin, Joseph Le Caron, and the lay brother Pacifique du Plessis. They packed their church ornaments, says Champlain, and we our luggage. All alike confessed their sins, and, embarking at Honfleur, reached Quebec at the end of May 1615. Great was the perplexity of the Indians as the apostolic mendicants landed beneath the rock. Their garb was a form of that common to the Brotherhood of St. Francis, consisting of a rude garment of coarse grey cloth, girt at the waist with the knotted cord of the order, and furnished with a peaked hood to be drawn over the head. Their naked feet were shod with wooden sandals more than an inch thick. Their first care was to choose a site for their convent, near the fortified dwellings and storehouses built by Champlain. This done, they made an altar, and celebrated the first Mass ever said in Canada. D'Olbin was the officiating priest. All New France kneeled on the bare earth around him, and cannon from the ship and the ramparts hailed the mystic rite. Then, in imitation of the apostles, they took counsel together, and assigned to each his province in the vast field of their mission. To Le Caron were the Hurons, and to D'Olbin the Montagnais, while Jamet and Du Plessis were to remain for the present near Quebec. D'Olbin, full of zeal, set out for his post, and in the next winter tried to follow the roving hordes of Tadoussac to their frozen hunting grounds. He was not robust, and his eyes were weak. Lodged in a hut of birch bark, full of abominations, dogs, fleas, stench, and all uncleanness, he succumbed at length to the smoke, which had well nigh blinded him, forcing him to remain for several days with his eyes closed. After debating within himself whether God required of him the sacrifice of his sight, he solved his doubts with a negative, and returned to Quebec, only to depart again with opening spring on a tour so extensive that it brought him in contact with outlying bands of the Esquimaux. Meanwhile Le Caron had long been absent on a more noteworthy mission. While his brethren were building their convent and garnishing their altar at Quebec, the ardent friar had hastened to the site of Montreal, then thronged with a savage concourse come down for the yearly trade. He mingled with them, studied their manners, tried to learn their languages, and, when Champlain and Pontgrave arrived, declared his purpose of wintering in their villages. Dissuasion availed nothing. What, he demanded, are privations to him whose life is devoted to perpetual poverty, and who has no ambition but to serve God? The assembled Indians were more eager for temporal than for spiritual succour, and beset Champlain with clamours for aid against the Iroquois. He and Pontgrave were of one mind. The aid demanded must be given, and that from no motive of the hour, but in pursuance of a deliberate policy. It was evident that the innumerable tribes of New France, otherwise divided, were united in a common fear and hate of these formidable bands, who, in the strength of their fivefold league, spread havoc and desolation through all the surrounding wilds. It was the aim of Champlain, as of his successors, to persuade the threatened and endangered hordes to live at peace with each other, and to form against the common foe a virtual league, of which the French colony would be the heart and head, and which would continually widen with the widening area of discovery. With French soldiers to fight their battles, French priests to baptize them, and French traders to supply their increasing wants, their dependence would be complete. They would become assured tributaries to the growth of New France. It was a triple alliance of soldier, priest, and trader. The soldier might be a roving knight, and the priest a martyr and a saint, but both alike were subserving the interests of that commerce which formed the only solid basis of the colony. The scheme of English colonization made no account of the Indian tribes. In the scheme of French colonization they were all in all. In one point the plan was fatally defective, since it involved the deadly enmity of a race whose character and whose power were as yet but ill understood, the fiercest, boldest, most politic, and most ambitious savages to whom the American forest has ever given birth. The chiefs and warriors met in council, Algonquins of the Ottawa, and Hurons from the borders of the great freshwater sea. Champlain promised to join them with all the men at his command, while they, on their part, were to muster without delay 2,500 warriors for an inroad into the country of the Iroquois. He descended at once to Quebec for needful preparation; but when, after a short delay, he returned to Montreal, he found to his chagrin a solitude. The wild concourse had vanished; nothing remained but the skeleton poles of their huts, the smoke of their fires, and the refuse of their encampments. Impatient at his delay, they had set out for their villages, and with them had gone Father Joseph Le Caron. 12 Frenchmen, well armed, had attended him. Summer was at its height, and as his canoe stole along the bosom of the glassy river, and he gazed about him on the tawny multitude, whose fragile craft covered the water like swarms of gliding insects, he thought perhaps of his whitewashed cell in the convent of Bruges, of his book, his table, his rosary, and all the narrow routine of that familiar life from which he had awakened to contrasts so startling. That his progress up the Ottawa was far from being an excursion of pleasure is attested by his letters, fragments of which have come down to us. "It would be hard to tell you," he writes to a friend, "how tired I was with paddling all day, with all my strength, among the Indians, wading the rivers 100 times and more, through the mud and over the sharp rocks that cut my feet, carrying the canoe and luggage through the woods to avoid the rapids and frightful cataracts, and half starved all the while, for we had nothing to eat but a little sagentite, a sort of porridge of water and pounded maize, of which they gave us a very small allowance every morning and night. But I must needs tell you what abundant consolation I found under all my troubles, for when one sees so many infidels needing nothing but a drop of water to make them children of God, one feels an inexpressible ardor to labor for their conversion, and sacrifice to it one's repose and life." Another Recollet, Gabriel Sagard, followed the same route in similar company a few years later, and has left an account of his experience, of which Le Caron's was the counterpart. Sagard reckons from 80 to 100 waterfalls and rapids in the course of the journey, and the task of avoiding them by pushing through the woods was the harder for him because he saw fit to go barefoot, in imitation of our seraphic father, St. Francis. We often came upon rocks, mud holes, and fallen trees, which we had to scramble over, and sometimes we must force our way with heads and hands through dense woods and thickets, without road or path. When the time came, my Indians looked for a good place to pass the night. Some went for dry wood, others for poles to make a shed, others kindled a fire, and hung the kettle to a stick stuck aslant in the ground, and others looked for 2 flat stones to bruise the Indian corn, of which they make sagamite. This sagamite was an extremely thin porridge, and though scraps of fish were now and then boiled in it, the friar pined away daily on this weak and scanty fare, which was, moreover, made repulsive to him by the exceeding filthiness of the cookery. Nevertheless, he was forced to disguise his feelings. One must always keep a smiling, modest, contented face, and now and then sing a hymn, both for his own consolation and to please and edify the savages, who take a singular pleasure in hearing us sing the praises of our God. Among all his trials, none afflicted him so much as the flies and mosquitoes. If I had not kept my face wrapped in a cloth, I am almost sure they would have blinded me, so pestiferous and poisonous are the bites of these little demons. They make one look like a leper, hideous to the sight. I confess that this is the worst martyrdom I suffered in this country. Hunger, thirst, weariness, and fever are nothing to it. These little beasts not only persecute you all day, but at night they get into your eyes and mouth, crawl under your clothes, or stick their long stings through them, and make such a noise that it distracts your attention, and prevents you from saying your prayers. He reckons 3 or 4 kinds of them, and adds that in the Montagnais country there is still another kind, so small that they can hardly be seen, but which bite like devil's imps. The sportsman who has bivouacked in the woods of Maine will at once recognize the minute tormentors there known as no-see-ums. While through tribulations like these Le Caron made his way towards the scene of his apostleship, Champlain was following on his track. With 2 canoes, 10 Indians, Etienne Brule as his interpreter, and another Frenchman, he pushed up the Ottawa till he reached the Algonquin villages which had formed the term of his former journeying. He passed the 2 lakes of the Alouettes, and now, for 20 miles, the river stretched before him, straight as the bee can fly, deep, narrow, and black, between its mountain shores. He passed the rapids of the Wakims and the Caribou, the Rocher Captain, and the Deux Rivières, and reached at length the tributary waters of the Matawan. He turned to the left, ascended this little stream 40 miles or more, and crossing a portage track, well trodden, reached the margin of Lake Nipissing. The canoes were launched again, and glided by leafy shores and verdant islands till at length appeared signs of human life, and clusters of bark lodges, half hidden in the vastness of the woods. It was the village of an Algonquin band, called the Nipissings, a race so beset with spirits, infested by demons, and abounding in magicians, that the Jesuits afterwards stigmatized them as the sorcerers. In this questionable company Champlain spent 2 days, feasted on fish, deer, and bears. Then, descending to the outlet of the lake, he steered his canoes westward down the current of French River. Days passed, and no sign of man enlivened the rocky desolation. Hunger was pressing them hard, for the 10 gluttonous Indians had devoured nearly all their provision for the voyage, and they were forced to subsist on the blueberries and wild raspberries that grew abundantly in the meagre soil, when suddenly they encountered a troop of 300 savages, whom, from their strange and startling mode of wearing their hair, Champlain named the Chevaux Relèves. Not one of our courtiers, he says, takes so much pains in dressing his locks. Here, however, their care of the toilette ended, for though tattooed on various parts of the body, painted and armed with bows, arrows, and shields of bison hide, they wore no clothing whatever. Savage as was their aspect, they were busied in the pacific task of gathering blueberries for their winter store. Their demeanor was friendly, and from them the voyager learned that the great lake of the Hurons was close at hand. Now, far along the western sky was traced the watery line of that inland ocean, and first of white men except Friar Le Caron, Champlain beheld the Mer Douce, the fresh water sea of the Hurons. Before him, too far for sight, lay the spirit-haunted Manitonolins, and southward spread the vast bosom of the Georgian Bay. For more than 100 miles, his course was along its eastern shores, among islets countless as the sea sands, an archipelago of rocks worn for ages by the wash of waves. He crossed Byng Inlet, Franklin Inlet, Parry Sound, and the wider Bay of Matchedash, and seems to have landed at the inlet now called Thunder Bay, at the entrance of the Bay of Matchedash, and a little west of the harbour of Penetanguishene. An Indian trail led inland, through woods and thickets, across broad meadows, over brooks, and along the skirts of green acclivities. To the eye of Champlain, accustomed to the desolation he had left behind, it seemed a land of beauty and abundance. He reached at last a broad opening in the forest, with fields of maize, pumpkins ripening in the sun, patches of sunflowers, from the seeds of which the Indians made hair oil, and in the midst the Huron town of Otanacha. In all essential points it resembled that which Cartier, 80 years before, had seen at Montreal, the same triple palisade of crossed and intersected trunks, and the same long lodges of bark, each containing several families. Here, within an area of 30 or 40 miles, was the seat of one of the most remarkable savage communities on the continent. By the Indian standard it was a mighty nation, yet the entire Huron population did not exceed that of a third or fourth class American city. To the south and southeast lay other tribes of kindred race and tongue, all stationary, all tillers of the soil, and all in a state of social advancement when compared with the roving bands of eastern Canada, the neutral nation west of the Niagara, and the Eries and Andestes in western New York and Pennsylvania, while from the Genesee eastward to the Hudson lay the banded tribes of the Iroquois, leading members of this potent family, deadly foes of their kindred, and at last their destroyers. In Champlain the Hurons saw the champion who was to lead them to victory. There was bountiful feasting in his honour in the great lodge at Otanacha, and other welcome, too, was tendered, of which the Hurons were ever liberal, but which, with all courtesy, was declined by the virtuous Champlain. Next he went to Carmeron, a league distant, and then to Tonagnanchain and Tequanonquihike, till at length he reached Carhagua, with its triple palisade 35 feet high. Here he found Le Caron. The Indians, eager to do him honour, were building for him a bark lodge in the neighbouring forest, fashioned like their own, but much smaller. In it the friar made an altar, garnished with those indispensable decorations which he had brought with him through all the vicissitudes of his painful journeying, and hither, night and day, came a curious multitude to listen to his enunciation of the new doctrine. It was a joyful hour when he saw Champlain approach his hermitage, and the two men embraced like brothers long sundered. The 12th of August was a day evermore marked with white in the friar's calendar. Arrayed in priestly vestments, he stood before his simple altar; behind him his little band of Christians, the 12 Frenchmen who had attended him, and the 2 who had followed Champlain. Here stood their devout and valiant chief, and at his side that pioneer of pioneers, Etienne Brule the interpreter. The host was raised aloft, the worshippers kneeled. Then their rough voices joined in the hymn of praise, Te Deum Laudamus, and then a volley of their guns proclaimed the triumph of the faith to the Okies, the Manitous, and all the brood of anomalous devils who had reigned with undisputed sway in these wild realms of darkness. The brave friar, a true soldier of the Church, had led her forlorn hope into the fastnesses of hell, and now, with contented heart, he might depart in peace, for he had said the first Mass in the country of the Hurons. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part 2, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman. Part 2, Samuel Champlain and His Associates. Chapter 14, The Great War Party, 1615–1616. The lot of the favored guest of an Indian camp or village is idleness without repose, for he is never left alone, with the repletion of incessant and inevitable feasts. Tired of this inane routine, Champlain, with some of his Frenchmen, set forth on a tour of observation. Journeying at their ease by the Indian trails, they visited, in 3 days, 5 palisaded villages. The country delighted them, with its meadows, its deep woods, its pine and cedar thickets, full of hares and partridges, its wild grapes and plums, cherries, crab-apples, nuts, and raspberries. It was the 17th of August when they reached the Huron metropolis, Cahiag, in the modern township of Orillia, 3 leagues west of the river Severn, by which Lake Simcoe pours its waters into the bay of Matchedash. A shrill clamour of rejoicing, the fixed stare of wondering squaws, and the screaming flight of terrified children hailed the arrival of Champlain. By his estimate, the place contained 200 lodges, but they must have been relatively small, since, had they been of the enormous capacity sometimes found in these structures, Cahiag alone would have held the whole Huron population. Here was the chief rendezvous, and the town swarmed with gathering warriors. There was cheering news, for an allied nation, called Carentonans, probably identical with the Andastes, had promised to join the Hurons in the enemy's country with 500 men. Feasts and war dance consumed the days, till at length the tardy bands had all arrived, and, shouldering their canoes and scanty baggage, the naked hosts set forth. At the outlet of Lake Simcoe they all stopped to fish, their simple substitute for a commissariat. Hence, too, the intrepid Etienne Brule, at his own request, was sent with 12 Indians to hasten forward the 500 allied warriors, a dangerous venture, since his course must lie through the borders of the Iroquois. He set out on the 8th of September, and on the morning of the 10th, Champlain, shivering in his basket, awoke to see the meadows sparkling with early frost, soon to vanish under the bright autumnal sun. The Huron fleet pursued its course along Lake Simcoe, across the portage to Balsam or Sturgeon Lake, and down the chain of lakes which form the sources of the river Trent. As the long line of canoes moved on its way, no human life was seen, no sign of friend or foe, yet at times, to the fancy of Champlain, the borders of the stream seemed decked with groves and shrubbery by the hands of men, and the walnut trees, laced with grape vines, seemed decorations of a pleasure ground. They stopped and encamped for a deer hunt. 500 Indians, in line, like the skirmishes of an army advancing to battle, drove the game to the end of a woody point, and the canoe-men killed them with spears and arrows as they took to the river. Champlain and his men keenly relished the sport, but paid a heavy price for their pleasure. A Frenchman, firing at a buck, brought down an Indian, and there was need of liberal gifts to console the sufferer and his friends. The canoes now issued from the mouth of the Trent. Like a flock of venturous wildfowl, they put boldly out upon Lake Ontario, crossed it in safety, and landed within the borders of New York, on or near the point of land west of Hungary Bay. After hiding their light craft in the woods, the warriors took up their swift and wary march, filing in silence between the woods and the lake, for 4 leagues along the strand. Then they struck inland, threaded the forest, crossed the outlet of Lake Oneida, and after a march of 4 days, were deep within the limits of the Iroquois. On the 9th of October some of their scouts met a fishing party of this people, and captured them, 11 in number, men, women, and children. They were brought to the camp of the exultant Hurons. As a beginning of the jubilation, a chief cut a finger off of one of the women, but desisted from further torturing on the angry protest of Champlain, reserving that pleasure for a more convenient season. On the next day they reached an open space in the forest. The hostile town was close at hand, surrounded by rugged fields with a slovenly and savage cultivation. The young Hurons in advance saw the Iroquois at work among the pumpkins and maize, gathering their rustling harvest. Nothing could restrain the hare-brained and ungoverned crew. They screamed their war cry and rushed in, but the Iroquois snatched their weapons, killed and wounded 5 or 6 of the assailants, and drove back the rest discomfited. Champlain and his Frenchmen were forced to interpose, and the report of their pieces from the border of the woods stopped the pursuing enemy, who withdrew to their defences, bearing with them their dead and wounded. It appears to have been a fortified town of the Onondagas, the central tribe of the Iroquois Confederacy, standing, there is some reason to believe, within the limits of Madison County, a few miles south of Lake Oneida. Champlain describes its defensive works as much stronger than those of the Huron villages. They consisted of 4 concentric rows of palisades, formed of trunks of trees, 35 feet high, set aslant in the earth, and intersecting each other near the top, where they supported a kind of gallery, well defended by shot-proof timber, and furnished with wooden gutters for quenching fire. A pond or lake, which washed one side of the palisade, and was led by sluices within the town, gave an ample supply of water, while the galleries were well provided with magazines of stones. Champlain was greatly exasperated at the desultory and futile procedure of his Huron allies. Against his advice, they now withdrew to the distance of a cannon shot from the fort, and encamped in the forest, out of sight of the enemy. "I was moved," he says, "to speak to them roughly and harshly enough, in order to incite them to do their duty, for I foresaw that if things went according to their fancy, nothing but harm could come of it, to their loss and ruin." He proceeded, therefore, to instruct them in the art of war. In the morning, aided doubtless by his 10 or 12 Frenchmen, they set themselves with alacrity to their prescribed task. A wooden tower was made, high enough to overlook the palisade, and large enough to shelter 4 or 5 marksmen. Huge wooden shields, or movable parapets, like the mantelets of the Middle Ages, were also constructed. 4 hours sufficed to finish the work, and then the assault began. 200 of the strongest warriors dragged the tower forward, and planted it within a pike's length of the palisade. 3 arquebusiers mounted to the top, where, themselves well sheltered, they opened a raking fire along the galleries, now thronged with wild and naked defenders. But nothing could restrain the ungovernable Hurons. They abandoned their mantelets, and, deaf to every command, swarmed out like bees upon the open field, leaped, shouted, shrieking their war cries, and shot off their arrows, while the Iroquois, yelling defiance from their ramparts, sent back a shower of stones and arrows in reply. A Huron, bolder than the rest, ran forward with firebrands to burn the palisade, and others followed with wood to feed the flame. But it was stupidly kindled on the leeward side, without the protecting shields designed to cover it, and torrents of water, poured down from the gutters above, quickly extinguished it. The confusion was redoubled. Champlain strove in vain to restore order. Each warrior was yelling at the top of his throat, and his voice was drowned in the outrageous din. Thinking, as he says, that his head would split with shouting, he gave over the attempt, and busied himself and his men with picking off the Iroquois along their ramparts. The attack lasted 3 hours, when the assailants fell back to their fortified camp, with 17 warriors wounded. Champlain, too, had received an arrow in the knee, and another in the leg, which for the time disabled him. He was urgent, however, to renew the attack, while the Hurons, crestfallen and disheartened, refused to move from their camp unless the 500 allies, for some time expected, should appear. They waited 5 days in vain, beguiling the interval with frequent skirmishes, in which they were always worsted, then began hastily to retreat, carrying their wounded in the centre, while the Iroquois, sallying from their stronghold, showered arrows on their flanks and rear. The wounded, Champlain among the rest, after being packed in baskets made on the spot, were carried each on the back of a strong warrior, bundled in a heap, says Champlain, doubled and strapped together after such a fashion that one could move no more than an infant in swaddling clothes. The pain is extreme, as I can truly say from experience, having been carried several days in this way, since I could not stand, chiefly on account of the arrow wound I had got in the knee. I never was in such torment in my life, for the pain of the wound was nothing to that of being bound and pinioned on the back of one of our savages. I lost patience, and as soon as I could bear my weight I got out of this prison, or rather out of hell. At length the dismal march was ended. They reached the spot where their canoes were hidden, found them untouched, embarked, and recrossed to the northern shore of Lake Ontario. The Hurons had promised Champlain an escort to Quebec, but as the chiefs had little power, in peace or war, beyond that of persuasion, each warrior found good reason for refusing to lend his canoe. Champlain too had lost prestige. The man with the iron breast had proved not inseparably wedded to victory, and though the fault was their own, yet not the less was the lustre of their hero tarnished. There was no alternative. He must winter with the Hurons. The great war party broke into fragments, each band betaking itself to its hunting ground. A chief named Durantal, or Dorantal, offered Champlain the shelter of his lodge, and he was glad to accept it. Meanwhile, Etienne Brule had found cause to rue the hour when he undertook his hazardous mission to the Corentin allies. 3 years passed before Champlain saw him. It was in the summer of 1618 that, reaching the Sault St. Louis, he found there the interpreter, his hands and his swarthy face marked with traces of the ordeal he had passed. Brule then told him his story. He had gone, as already mentioned, with 12 Indians, to hasten the march of the allies, who were to join the Hurons before the hostile town. Crossing Lake Ontario, the party pushed onward with all speed, avoiding trails, threading the thicket forests and darkest swamps, for it was the land of the fierce and watchful Iroquois. They were well advanced on their way when they saw a small party of them crossing a meadow, set upon them, surprised them, killed 4 and took 2 prisoners, whom they led to Corentin, a palisaded town with a population of 800 warriors, or about 4,000 souls. The dwellings and defences were like those of the Hurons, and the town seems to have stood on or near the upper waters of the Susquehanna. They were welcomed with feasts, dances, and an uproar of rejoicing. The 500 warriors prepared to depart, but, engrossed by the general festivity, they prepared so slowly, that though the hostile town was but 3 days distant, they found on reaching it that the besiegers were gone. Brule now returned with them to Corentin, and, with enterprise worthy of his commander, spent the winter in a tour of exploration. Descending a river, evidently the Susquehanna, he followed it to its junction with the sea, through territories of populous tribes, at war the one with the other. When, in the spring, he returned to Corentin, 5 or 6 of the Indians offered to guide him towards his countrymen. Less fortunate than before, he encountered on the way a band of Iroquois, who, rushing upon the party, scattered them through the woods. Brule ran like the rest. The cries of pursuers and pursued died away in the distance. The forest was silent around him. He was lost in the shabby labyrinth. For 3 or 4 days he wandered, helpless and famished, till at length he found an Indian footpath, and, choosing between starvation and the Iroquois, desperately followed it to throw himself on their mercy. He soon saw 3 Indians in the distance, laden with fish newly caught, and called to them in the Huron tongue, which was radically similar to that of the Iroquois. They stood amazed, then turned to fly, but Brule, gaunt with famine, flung down his weapons in token of friendship. They now drew near, listened to the story of his distress, lighted their pipes, and smoked with him, then guided him to their village and gave him food. A crowd gathered about him. "Whence do you come? Are you not one of the Frenchmen, the men of iron, who make war on us?" Brule answered that he was of a nation better than the French, and fast friend of the Iroquois. His incredulous captors tied him to a tree, tore out his beard by handfuls, and burned him with firebrands, while their chief vainly interposed on his behalf. He was a good Catholic, and wore an Agnus Dei at his breast. One of his torturers asked what it was, and thrust out his hand to take it. "If you touch it," exclaimed Brule, "you and all your race will die." The Indian persisted. The day was hot, and one of those thunder gusts which often succeed the fierce heats of an American midsummer was rising against the sky. Brule pointed to the inky clouds as tokens of the anger of his god. The storm broke, and as the celestial artillery boomed over their darkening forests, the Iroquois were stricken with a superstitious terror. They all fled from the spot, leaving their victim still bound fast, until the chief who had endeavored to protect him returned, cut the cords, led him to his lodge, and dressed his wounds. Thenceforth there was neither dance nor feast to which Brule was not invited, and when he wished to return to his countrymen, a party of Iroquois guided him 4 days on his way. He reached the friendly Hurons in safety, and joined them on their yearly descent made to meet the French traders at Montreal. Brule's adventures find in some points their counterpart in those of his commander on the winter hunting grounds of his Huron allies. As we turn the ancient, worm-eaten page which preserves the simple record of his fortunes, a wild and dreary scene rises before the mind: a chill November air, a murky sky, a cold lake, bare and shivering forests, the earth strewn with crisp brown leaves, and by the waterside the bark sheds and smoking camp-fires of a band of Indian hunters. Champlain was of the party. There was ample occupation for his gun, for the morning was vocal with the clamour of wildfowl, and his evening meal was enlivened by the rueful music of the wolves. It was a lake north or northwest of the site of Kingston. On the borders of a neighbouring river, 25 of the Indians had been busied 10 days in preparing for their annual deer hunt. They planted posts interlaced with boughs in 2 straight converging lines, each extending more than half a mile through forests and swamps. At the angle where they met was made a strong enclosure like a pound. At dawn of day the hunters spread themselves through the woods, and advancing with shouts, clattering of sticks, and howlings like those of wolves, driving the deer before them into the enclosure, where others lay in wait to dispatch them with arrows and spears. Champlain was in the woods with the rest, when he saw a bird whose novel appearance excited his attention, and, gun in hand, he went in pursuit. The bird, flitting from tree to tree, lured him deeper and deeper into the forest, then took wing and vanished. The disappointed sportsman tried to retrace his steps; but the day was clouded, and he had left his pocket compass at the camp. The forest closed around him, trees mingled with trees in endless confusion. Bewildered and lost, he wandered all day, and at night slept fasting at the foot of a tree. Awaking, he wandered on till afternoon, when he reached a pond slumbering in the shadow of the woods. There were waterfowl along its brink, some of which he shot, and for the first time found food to allay his hunger. He kindled a fire, cooked his game, and, exhausted, blanketless, drenched by a cold rain, made his prayer to heaven, and again lay down to sleep. Another day of blind wandering succeeded, and another night of exhaustion. He had found paths in the wilderness, but they were not made by human feet. Once more roused from his shivering repose, he journeyed on till he heard the tinkling of a little brook, and bethought him of following its guidance, in the hope that it might lead him to the river where the hunters were now encamped. With toilsome steps he followed the infant stream, now lost beneath the decaying masses of fallen trunks or the impervious intricacies of matted windfalls, now stealing through swampy thickets or gurgling in the shade of rocks, till it entered at length, not into the river, but into a small lake. Circling around the brink, he found the point where the brook ran out and resumed its course. Listening in the dead stillness of the woods, a dull, hoarse sound rose upon his ear. He went forward, listened again, and could plainly hear the plunge of waters. There was a light in the forest before him, and, thrusting himself through the entanglement of bushes, he stood on the edge of a meadow. Wild animals were here of various kinds, some skulking in the bordering thickets, some browsing on the dry and matted grass. On his right rolled the river, wide and turbulent, and along its bank he saw the portage path by which the Indians passed the neighbouring rapids. He gazed about him. The rocky hills seemed familiar to his eye. A clue was found at last, and, kindling his evening fire, with grateful heart, he broke a long fast on the game he had killed. With the break of day he descended at his ease along the bank, and soon descried the smoke of the Indian fires curling in the heavy morning air against the grey borders of the forest. The joy was great on both sides. The Indians had searched for him without ceasing, and from that day forth his host, Durantal, would never let him go into the forest alone. They were 38 days encamped on this nameless river, and killed in that time 120 deer. Hard frosts were needful to give them passage over the land of lakes and marshes that lay between them and the Huron towns. Therefore they lay waiting till the 4th of December, when the frost came, bridged the lakes and streams, and made the oozy marsh as firm as granite. Snow followed, powdering the broad wastes with dreary white. Then they broke up their camp, packed their game on sledges or on their shoulders, tied on their snowshoes, and began their march. Champlain could scarcely endure his load, though some of the Indians carried a weight fivefold greater. At night they heard the cleaving ice uttering its strange groans of torment, and on the morrow there came a thaw. For 4 days they waded through slush and water up to their knees, then came the shivering northwest wind, and all was hard again. In 19 days they reached the town of Cahiag, and lounging around their smoky lodge fires, the hunters forgot the hardship of the past. For Champlain there was no rest. A double motive urged him: discovery, and the strengthening of his colony by widening its circle of trade. First he repaired to Carhagua, and here he found the friar, in his hermitage, still praying, preaching, making catechisms, and struggling with the manifold difficulties of the Huron tongue. After spending several weeks together, they began their journeyings, and in 3 days reached the chief village of the nation of Tobacco, a powerful tribe akin to the Hurons, and soon to be incorporated with them. The travellers visited 7 of their towns, and then passed westward to those of the people whom Champlain calls the Chevaux Relèves, and whom he commends for neatness and ingenuity no less than he condemns them for the nullity of their summer attire. As the strangers passed from town to town, their arrival was everywhere the signal of festivity. Champlain exchanged pledges of amity with his hosts, and urged them to come down with the Hurons to the yearly trade at Montreal. Spring was now advancing, and, anxious for his colony, he turned homeward, following that long circuit of Lake Huron and the Ottawa, which Iroquois hostility made the only practicable route. Scarcely had he reached the Nipissings, and gained from them a pledge to guide him to that delusive northern sea which never ceased to possess his thoughts, when evil news called him back in haste to the Huron towns. A band of those Algonquins who dwelt on the great island in the Ottawa had spent the winter encamped near Cahiag, whose inhabitants made them a present of an Iroquois prisoner, with the friendly intention that they should enjoy the pleasure of torturing him. The Algonquins, on the contrary, fed, clothed, and adopted him. On this, the donors, in a rage, sent a warrior to kill the Iroquois. He stabbed him, accordingly, in the midst of the Algonquin chiefs, who, in requital, killed the murderer. Here was a casus belli involving the most serious issues for the French, since the Algonquins, by their position on the Ottawa, could cut off the Hurons and all their allies from coming down to trade. Already a fight had taken place at Cahiag, the principal Algonquin chief had been wounded, and his band forced to purchase safety by a heavy tribute of wampum, and a gift of 2 female prisoners. All eyes turned to Champlain as umpire of the quarrel. The great council house was filled with Huron and Algonquin chiefs, smoking with that immobility of feature beneath which their race often hide a more than tiger-like ferocity. The umpire addressed the assembly, enlarged on the folly of falling to blows between themselves when the common enemy stood ready to devour them both, extolled the advantages of the French trade and alliance, and, with zeal not wholly disinterested, urged them to shake hands like brothers. The friendly counsel was accepted, the pipe of peace was smoked, the storm dispelled, and the commerce of New France rescued from a serious peril. Once more Champlain turned homeward, and with him went his Huron host, Durantal. Le Caron had preceded him, and, on the 11th of July, the fellow travellers met again in the infant capital of Canada. The Indians had reported that Champlain was dead, and he was welcomed as one risen from the grave. The friars, who were all here, chanted lands in their chapel, with a solemn mass and thanksgiving. To the 2 travellers, fresh from the hardships of the wilderness, the hospitable board of Quebec, the kindly society of countrymen and friends, the adjacent gardens, always to Champlain an object of especial interest, seemed like the comforts and repose of home. The chief Durantal found entertainment worthy of his high estate. The fort, the ship, the armour, the plumes, the cannon, the marvellous architecture of the houses and barracks, the splendours of the chapel, and above all the good cheer outran the boldest excursion of his fancy, and he paddled back at last to his lodge in the woods, bewildered with astonishment and admiration. End of chapter 14. Chapter 14 of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part 2, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman. Part 2, Samuel Champlain and His Associates. Chapter 15, Hostile Sects, Rival Interests, 1616 to 1627. At Quebec the signs of growth were faint and few. By the waterside, under the cliff, the so-called habitation, built in haste 8 years before, was already tottering, and Champlain was forced to rebuild it. On the verge of the rock above, where now are seen the buttresses of the demolished castle of St. Louis, he began, in 1620, a fort, behind which were fields and a few buildings. A mile or more distant, by the bank of the St. Charles, where the General Hospital now stands, the Recollets, in the same year, built for themselves a small stone house, with ditches and outworks for defence, and here they began a farm, the stock consisting of several hogs, a pair of asses, a pair of geese, 7 pairs of fowls, and 4 pairs of ducks. The only other agriculturalist in the colony was Louis Hubert, who had come to Canada in 1617 with a wife and 3 children, and who made a house for himself on the rock at a little distance from Champlain's fort. Besides Quebec, there were the 3 trading stations of Montreal, 3 Rivers, and Tadoussac, occupied during a part of the year. Of these, Tadoussac was still the most important. Landing here from France in 1617, the Recollet Paul Huet said Mass for the first time in a chapel built of branches, while 2 sailors standing beside him waved green boughs to drive off the mosquitoes. Thither afterward came Brother Gervais Mohier, newly arrived in Canada, and meeting a crowd of Indians in festal attire, he was frightened at first, and suspected that they might be demons. Being invited by them to a feast, and told that he must not decline, he took his place among a party of 200, squatted about 4 large kettles full of fish, bear's meat, pease, and plums, mixed with figs, raisins, and biscuit procured at great cost from the traders, the whole boiled together and well stirred with a canoe paddle. As the guest did no honour to the portion set before him, his entertainers tried to tempt his appetite with a large lump of bear's fat, a supreme luxury in their eyes. This only increased his embarrassment, and he took a hasty leave, uttering the ejaculation "Ho, ho, ho," which, as he had been correctly informed, was the proper mode of acknowledgment to the master of the feast. A change had now begun in the life of Champlain. His forest rovings were over. To battle with savages and the elements was more congenial with his nature than to nurse a puny colony into growth and strength, yet to each task he gave himself with the same strong devotion. His difficulties were great. Quebec was half trading factory, half mission. Its permanent inmates did not exceed 50 or 60 persons, fur traders, friars, and 2 or 3 wretched families, who had no inducement and little wish to labour. The fort is facetiously represented as having 2 old women for garrison, and a brace of hens for sentinels. All was discord and disorder. Champlain was the nominal commander, but the actual authority was with the merchants, who held, excepting the friars, nearly everybody in their pay. Each was jealous of the other, but all were united in a common jealousy of Champlain. The few families whom they brought over were forbidden to trade with the Indians, and compelled to sell the fruits of their labour to the agents of the company at a low fixed price, receiving goods in return at an inordinate valuation. Some of the merchants were of Ronin, some of St. Malo, some were Catholics, some were Huguenots. Hence unceasing bickerings. All exercise of the reformed religion, on land or water, was prohibited within the limits of New France, but the Huguenots set the prohibition at naught, roaring their heretical psalmody with such vigour from their ships on the river that the unhallowed strains polluted the ears of the Indians on shore. The merchants of Rochelle, who had refused to join the company, carried on a bold, illicit traffic along the borders of the St. Lawrence, endangering the colony by selling firearms to the Indians, eluding pursuit, or if hard pressed, showing fight, and this was a source of perpetual irritation to the incensed monopolists. The colony could not increase. The company of merchants, though pledged to promote its growth, did what they could to prevent it. They were fur traders, and the interests of the fur trader always opposed to those of settlement and population. They feared, too, and with reason, that their monopoly might be suddenly revoked, like that of De Monts, and they thought only of making profit from it while it lasted. They had no permanent stake in the country, nor had the men in their employ, those who formed nearly all the scanty population of Canada. Few, if any, of these had brought wives to the colony, and none of them thought of cultivating the soil. They formed a floating population, kept from starving by yearly supplies from France. Champlain, in his singularly trying position, displayed a mingled zeal and fortitude. He went every year to France, labouring for the interests of the colony. To throw open the trade to all competitors was a measure beyond the wisdom of the times, and he hoped only to bind and regulate the monopoly so as to make it subserve the generous purpose to which he had given himself. The imprisonment of Condé was a source of fresh embarrassment, but the young Duo de Montmorency assumed his place, purchasing from him the profitable lieutenancy of New France for 11,000 crowns, and continuing Champlain in command. Champlain had succeeded in binding the company of merchants, with new and more stringent engagements, and in the vain belief that these might not be wholly broken, he began to conceive fresh hopes for the colony. In this faith he embarked with his wife for Quebec in the spring of 1620, and as the boat drew near the landing, the cannon welcomed her to the rock of her banishment. The buildings were falling to ruin, rain entering on all sides. The courtyard, says Champlain, was as squalid and dilapidated as a grange pillaged by soldiers. Madame de Champlain was still very young. If the Ursuline tradition is to be trusted, the Indians, amazed at her beauty and touched by her gentleness, would have worshipped her as a divinity. Her husband had married her at the age of 12, when, to his horror, he presently discovered that she was infected with the heresies of her father, a disguised Huguenot. He addressed himself at once to her conversion, and his pious efforts were something more than successful. During the 4 years which she passed in Canada, her zeal, it is true, was chiefly exercised in admonishing Indian squaws and catechizing their children, but on her return to France, nothing would content her but to become a nun. Champlain refused, but as she was childless, he at length consented to a virtual, though not formal, separation. After his death she gained her wish, became an Ursuline nun, founded a convent of that order at Meaux, and died with a reputation almost saintly. At Quebec matters grew from bad to worse. The few immigrants, with no inducement to labour, fell into lazy apathy, lounging about the trading houses, gaming, drinking when drink could be had, or roving into the woods on vagabond hunting excursions. The Indians could not be trusted. In the year 1617 they had murdered 2 men near the end of the island of Orleans. Frightened at what they had done, and incited perhaps by other causes, the Montagnais and their kindred bands mustered at 3 Rivers to the number of 800, resolved to destroy the French. The secret was betrayed, and the childish multitude, naked and famishing, became suppliants to their intended victims for the means of life. The French, themselves at the point of starvation, could give little or nothing. An enemy far more formidable awaited them, and now were seen the fruits of Champlain's intermeddling in Indian affairs. In the summer of 1622 the Iroquois descended upon the settlement. A strong party of their warriors hovered about Quebec, but still, fearful of the arquebus, forbore to attack it, and assailed the Recollet convent on the St. Charles. The prudent friars had fortified themselves. While some prayed in the chapel, the rest with their Indian converts manned the walls. The Iroquois respected their palisades and demilunes, and withdrew, after burning 2 Huron prisoners. Yielding at length to reiterated complaints, the Viceroy Montmorency suppressed the company of St. Malo and Rouen, and conferred the trade of New France, burdened with similar conditions destined to be similarly broken, on 2 Huguenots, William and Emery de Caen. The change was a signal for fresh disorders. The enraged monopolists refused to yield. The rival traders filled Quebec with their quarrels, and Champlain, seeing his authority set at naught, was forced to occupy his newly built fort with a band of armed followers. The evil rose to such a pitch that he joined with the Recollets, and better disposed among the colonists in sending one of the friars to lay their grievances before the king. The dispute was compromised by a temporary union of the 2 companies, together with a variety of arrêtés and regulations, situated, it was thought, to restore tranquillity. A new change was at hand. Montmorency, tired of his viceroyalty, which gave him ceaseless annoyance, sold it to his nephew, Henri de Lévis, Duc de Ventadour. It was no worldly motive which prompted this young nobleman to assume the burden of fostering the infancy of New France. He had retired from court, and entered into holy orders. For trade and colonization he cared nothing; the conversion of infidels was his sole care. The Jesuits had the keeping of his conscience, and in his eyes they were the most fitting instruments for his purpose. The Recollets, it is true, had laboured with an unflagging devotion. The 6 friars of their order, for this was the number which the Calvinist Caen had bound himself to support, had established 5 distinct missions, extending from Acadia to the borders of Lake Huron, but the field was too vast for their powers. Ostensibly by a spontaneous movement of their own, but in reality, it is probable, under influences brought to bear on them from without, the Recollets applied for assistance of the Jesuits, who, strong in resources as in energy, would not be compelled to rest on the reluctant support of the Huguenots. 3 of their brotherhood, Charles Lalemant, Ennemond Mas, and Jean de Brebeuf, accordingly embarked, and 14 years after Billard and Mas had landed in Acadia, Canada beheld for the first time those whose names stand so prominent in her annals, the mysterious followers of Loyola. Their reception was most inauspicious. Champlain was absent. Caen would not lodge them in the fort; the traders would not admit them to their houses. Nothing seemed left for them but to return as they came, when a boat, bearing several Recollets, approached the ship to proffer them the hospitalities of the convent on the St. Charles. They accepted the proffer, and became guests of the charitable friars, who nevertheless entertained a lurking jealousy of these formidable co-workers. The Jesuits soon unearthed and publicly burnt a libel against their order belonging to some of the traders. Their strength was soon increased. The Fathers Noyrot and Delannoy landed, with 20 labourers, and the Jesuits were no longer houseless. Brebeuf set forth for the arduous mission of the Hurons, but on arriving at Trois Rivières he learned that one of his Franciscan predecessors, Nicolas Viel, had recently been drowned by Indians of that tribe, in the rapid behind Montreal, known to this day as the Saut aux Recollets. Less ambitious for martyrdom than he afterwards approved himself, he postponed his voyage to a more auspicious season. In the following spring he renewed the attempt, in company with Delannoy and one of the friars. The Indians, however, refused to receive him into their canoes, alleging that his tall and portly frame would overset them, and it was only by dint of many presents that their pretended scruples could be conquered. Brebeuf embarked with his companions, and after months of toil, reached the barbarous scene of his labours, his sufferings, and his death. Meanwhile the Viceroy had been deeply scandalized by the contumacious heresy of Emery de Caen, who not only assembled his Huguenot sailors at prayers, but forced Catholics to join them. He was ordered thenceforth to prohibit his crews from all praying and psalm singing on the river St. Lawrence. The crews revolted, and a compromise was made. It was agreed that for the present they might pray, but not sing. "A bad bargain," says the pious Champlain, "but we made the best of it we could." Caen, outraged at the Viceroy's reproofs, lost no opportunity to vent his spleen against the Jesuits, whom he cordially hated. 18 years had passed since the founding of Quebec, and still the colony could scarcely be said to exist but in the founder's brain. Those who should have been its support were engrossed by trade or propagandism. Champlain might look back on fruitless toils, hopes deferred, a life spent seemingly in vain. The population of Quebec had risen to 105 persons, men, women, and children. Of these, 1 or 2 families only had learned to support themselves from the products of the soil. All withered under the monopoly of the Caens. Champlain had long desired to rebuild the fort, which was weak and ruinous, but the merchants would not grant the men and means which, by their charter, they were bound to furnish. At length, however, his urgency in part prevailed, and the work began to advance. Meanwhile the Caens and their associates had greatly prospered, paying, it is said, an annual dividend of 40 per cent. In a single year they brought from Canada 22,000 beaver skins, though the usual number did not exceed 12 or 15,000. While infant Canada was thus struggling into a half-stifled being, the foundation of a commonwealth destined to marvellous vigour of development had been laid on the rock of Plymouth. In their character, as in their destiny, the rivals were widely different, yet at the outset New England was unfaithful to the principle of freedom. New England Protestantism appealed to liberty, then closed the door against her, for all Protestantism is an appeal from priestly authority to the right of private judgment, and the New England Puritan, after claiming this right for himself, denied it to all who differed with him. On a stalk of freedom he grafted a scion of despotism, yet the vital juices of the root penetrated at last to the outermost branches, and nourished them to an irrepressible strength and expansion. With New France it was otherwise. She was consistent to the last. Root, stem, and branch, she was the nursling of authority. Deadly absolutism blighted her early and her later growth. Friars and Jesuits, a Ventadour and a Richelieu, shaped her destinies. All that conflicted against advancing liberty, the centralized power of the crown and the tiara, the ultramontane in religion, the despotic in policy, found their fullest expression and most fatal exercise. Her records shine with glorious deeds, the self-devotion of heroes and martyrs, and the result of all is disorder, imbecility, and ruin. The great champion of absolutism, Richelieu, was now supreme in France. His thin frame, pale cheek, and cold, calm eye concealed an inexorable will and a mind of vast capacity, armed with all the resources of boldness and craft. Under his potent agency, the royal power, in the weak hands of Louis XIII., waxed and strengthened daily, triumphing over the factions of the court, the turbulence of the Huguenots, the ambitious independence of the nobles, and all the elements of anarchy which, since the death of Henry IV., had risen into fresh life. With no friends and 1,000 enemies, disliked and feared by the pitiful king whom he served, making his tool by turns of every party and of every principle, he advanced by countless crooked paths toward his object, the greatness of France under a concentrated and undivided authority. In the midst of more urgent cares, he addressed himself to fostering the commercial and naval power. Montmorency then held the ancient charge of Admiral of France. Richelieu bought it, suppressed it, and in its stead constituted himself Grand Master and Superintendent of Navigation and Commerce. In this new capacity, the mismanaged affairs of New France were not long concealed from him, and he applied a prompt and powerful remedy. The privileges of the Caens were annulled. A company was formed, to consist of 100 associates, and to be called the Company of New France. Richelieu himself was the head, and the Marechal d'Effiat and other men of rank, besides many merchants and burghers of condition, were members. The whole of New France, from Florida to the Arctic Circle, and from Newfoundland to the sources of the St. Lawrence and its tributary waters, was conferred on them forever, with the attributes of sovereign power. A perpetual monopoly of the fur trade was granted them, with a monopoly of all other commerce within the limits of their government for 15 years. The trade of the colony was declared free, for the same period, from all duties and imposts. Nobles, officers, and ecclesiastics, members of the company, might engage in commercial pursuits without derogating from the privileges of their order, and, in evidence of his good will, the king gave them 2 ships of war, armed and equipped. On their part, the company were bound to convey to New France during the next year, 1628, 200 or 300 men of all trades, and before the year 1643 to increase the number to 4,000 persons of both sexes, to lodge and support them for 3 years, and this time expired, give them cleared lands for their maintenance. Every settler must be a Frenchman and a Catholic, and for every new settlement at least 3 ecclesiastics must be provided. Thus was New France to be for ever free from the taint of heresy. The stain of her infancy was to be wiped away. Against the foreigner and the Huguenot the door was closed and barred. England threw open her colonies to all who wished to enter, the suffering and the oppressed, the bold, active, and enterprising. France shut out those who wished to come, and admitted only those who did not, the favoured class who clung to the old faith and had no motive or disposition to leave their homes. English colonization obeyed a natural law, and sailed with wind and tide. French colonization spent its whole struggling existence in futile efforts to make head against them. The English colonists developed inherited freedom on a virgin soil. The French colonist was pursued across the Atlantic by a paternal despotism, better in intention and more withering in effect than that which he left behind him. If, instead of excluding Huguenots, France had given them an asylum in the West, and left them there to work out their own destinies, Canada would never have been a British province, and the United States would have shared her vast domain with a vigorous population of self-governing Frenchmen. A trading company was now feudal proprietor of all domains in North America, within the claim of France. Fealty and homage on its part, and on the part of the Crown the appointment of supreme judicial officers, and the confirmation of the titles of dukes, marquises, counts, and barons were the only reservations. The king heaped favours on the new corporation. 12 of the bourgeois members were ennobled, while artisans and even manufacturers were tempted, by extraordinary privileges, to emigrate to the New World. The associates, of whom Champlain was one, entered upon their functions with a capital of 300,000 livres. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part 2, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman. Part 2, Samuel Champlain and His Associates. Chapter 16, The English at Quebec, 1628-1629. The first care of the new company was to succour Quebec, whose inmates were on the verge of starvation. 4 armed vessels, with a fleet of transports commanded by Roquemont, one of the associates, sailed from Dieppe with colonists and supplies in April 1628, but nearly at the same time another squadron, destined also for Quebec, was sailing from an English port. War had at length broken out in France. The Huguenot revolt had come to a head. Rochelle was in arms against the king, and Richelieu, with his royal ward, was beleaguering it with the whole strength of the kingdom. Charles I. of England, urged by the heated passions of Buckingham, had declared himself for the rebels, and sent a fleet to their aid. At home, Charles detested the followers of Calvin as dangerous to his own authority; abroad, he befriended them as dangerous to the authority of a rival. In France, Richelieu crushed Protestantism as a curb to the House of Bourbon; in Germany, he nursed and strengthened it as a curb to the House of Austria. The attempts of Sir William Alexander to colonize Acadia had of late turned attention in England towards the New World, and on the breaking out of the war an expedition was set on foot, under the auspices of that singular personage, to seize on the French possessions in North America. It was a private enterprise, undertaken by London merchants, prominent amongst whom was Gervase Kirke, an Englishman of Derbyshire, who had long lived at Dieppe, and had there married a Frenchwoman. Gervase Kirke and his associates fitted out 3 small armed ships, commanded respectively by his sons David, Louis, and Thomas. Letters of marque were obtained from the king, and the adventurers were authorized to drive out the French from Acadia and Canada. Many Huguenot refugees were among the crews. Having been expelled from New France as settlers, the persecuted sect were returning as enemies. One Captain Michel, who had been in the service of the Caens, a furious Calvinist, is said to have instigated the attempt, acting, it is affirmed, under the influence of one of his former employers. Meanwhile, the famished tenants of Quebec were eagerly awaiting the expected succour. Daily they gazed beyond Point Levis and along the channel of Orleans, in the vain hope of seeing the approaching sails. At length, on the 9th of July, 2 men, worn with struggling through forests and over torrents, crossed the St. Charles and mounted the rock. They were from Cape Tourmente, where Champlain had some time before established an outpost, and they brought news that, according to the report of Indians, 6 large vessels lay in the harbour of Tadoussac. The friar Le Caron was at Quebec, and, with a brother Recollet, he went in a canoe to gain further intelligence. As missionary scouts were paddling along the borders of the island of Orleans, they met 2 canoes advancing in hot haste, manned by Indians, who with shouts and gestures warned them to turn back. The friars, however, waited till the canoes came up, when they saw a man lying disabled at the bottom of one of them, his moustaches burnt by the flash of the musket which had wounded him. He proved to be Fouché, who commanded at Cape Tourmente. On that morning, such was the story of the fugitives, 20 men had landed at that post from a small fishing vessel. Being to all appearance French, they were hospitably received, but no sooner had they entered the houses than they began to pillage and burn all before them, killing the cattle, wounding the commandant, and making several prisoners. The character of the fleet at Tadoussac was now sufficiently clear. Quebec was incapable of defence. Only 50 pounds of gunpowder were left in the magazine, and the fort, owing to the neglect and ill will of the Caens, was so wretchedly constructed that a few days before 2 towers of the main building had fallen. Champlain, however, assigned to each man his post, and waited the result. On the next afternoon a boat was seen issuing from behind the point of Orleans, and hovering hesitatingly about the mouth of the St. Charles. On being challenged, the men on board proved to be Basque fishermen, lately captured by the English, and now sent by Kirke unwilling messengers to Champlain. Climbing the steep pathway to the fort, they delivered their letter, a summons, couched in terms of great courtesy, to surrender Quebec. There was no hope but in courage. A bold front must supply the lack of batteries and ramparts, and Champlain dismissed the Basques with a reply, in which, with equal courtesy, he expressed his determination to hold his position to the last. All now stood on the watch, hourly expecting the enemy, when, instead of the hostile squadron, a small boat crept into sight, and one des Dames, with 10 Frenchmen, landed at the storehouses. He brought stirring news. The French commander, Roquemont, had dispatched him to tell Champlain that the ships of the 100 Associates were ascending the St. Lawrence, with reinforcements and supplies of all kinds. But on his way des Dames had seen an ominous sight, the English squadron standing under full sail out of Tadoussac, and steering downwards as if to intercept the advancing succour. He had only escaped them by dragging his boat up the beach and hiding it, and scarcely were they out of sight when the booming of cannon told him that the fight was begun. Racked with suspense, the starving tenants of Quebec waited the result, but they waited in vain. No white sail moved athwart the green solitude of Orleans. Neither friend nor foe appeared, and it was not till long afterward that Indians brought them the tidings that Roquemont's crowded transports had been overpowered, and all the supplies destined to relieve their miseries sunk in the St. Lawrence or seized by the victorious English. Kirke, however, deceived by the bold attitude of Champlain, had been too discreet to attack Quebec, and after his victory employed himself in cruising for French fishing vessels along the borders of the Gulf. Meanwhile, the suffering at Quebec increased daily. Somewhat less than 100 men, women, and children were cooped up in the fort, subsisting on a meagre pittance of peas and Indian corn. The garden of the Hebers, the only thrifty settlers, was ransacked for every root or seed that could afford nutriment. Months wore on, and in the spring the distress had risen to such a pitch that Champlain had well nigh resolved to leave the women, children, and sick the little food that remained, and with the able-bodied men invade the Iroquois, seize one of their villages, fortify himself in it, and sustain his followers on the buried stores of maize with which the strongholds of these provident savages were always furnished. 7 ounces of pounded peas were now the daily food of each, and at the end of May even this failed. Men, women, and children betook themselves to the woods, gathering acorns and grubbing up roots. Those of the plant called Solomon's seal were most in request. Some joined the Hurons or the Algonquins, some wandered towards the Abenakis of Maine, some descended in a boat to Gaspé, trusting to meet a French fishing vessel. There was scarcely one who would not have hailed the English as deliverers. But the English had sailed home with their booty, and the season was so late that there was little prospect of their return. Forgotten alike by friends and foes, Quebec was on the verge of extinction. On the morning of the 19th of July, an Indian, renowned as a fisher of eels, who had built his hut on the St. Charles, hard by the new dwelling of the Jesuits, came, with his unusual imperturbability of visage, to Champlain. He had just discovered 3 ships sailing up the south channel of Orleans. Champlain was alone. All his followers were absent, fishing or searching for roots. At about 10 o'clock his servant appeared with 4 small bags of roots, and the tidings that he had seen the 3 ships a league off, behind Point Levis. As man after man hastened in, Champlain ordered the starved and ragged band, 16 in all, to their posts, whence with hungry eyes they watched the English vessels anchoring in the basin below, and a boat with a white flag moving towards the shore. A young officer landed with a summons to surrender. The terms of capitulation were at length settled. The French were to be conveyed to their own country, and each soldier was allowed to take with him his clothes and in addition a coat of beaver skin. On this some murmuring arose, several of those who had gone to the Hurons having lately returned with peltry of no small value. Their complaints were vain, and on the 20th of July, amid the roar of cannon from the ships, Louis Kirke, the admiral's brother, landed at the head of his soldiers, and planted the cross of St. George where the followers of Wolfe again planted it 130 years later. After inspecting the worthless fort, he repaired to the houses of the Recollets and Jesuits on the St. Charles. He treated the former with a great courtesy, but displayed against the latter a violent aversion, expressing his regret that he could not have begun his operations by battering their house about their ears. The inhabitants had no cause to complain of him. He urged the widow and family of the settler Hebert, the patriarch, as he has been styled, of New France, to remain and enjoy the fruits of their industry under English alliance, and as beggary in France was the alternative, his offer was accepted. Champlain, bereft of his command, grew restless, and begged to be sent to Tadoussac, where the admiral, David Kirke, lay with his main squadron, having sent his brothers Louis and Thomas to seize Quebec. Accordingly, Champlain, with the Jesuits, embarking with Thomas Kirke, descended the river. Off Mall Bay a strange sail was seen. As she approached she proved to be a French ship. In fact, she was on her way to Quebec with supplies, which if earlier sent would have saved the place. She had passed the admiral's squadron in a fog, but here her good fortune ceased. Thomas Kirke bore down on her, and the cannonade began. The fight was hot and doubtful, but at length the French struck, and Kirke sailed into Tadoussac with his prize. Here lay his brother, the admiral, with 5 ships. The admiral's 2 voyages to Canada were private ventures, and though he had captured 19 fishing vessels, besides Roquemont's 18 transports and other prizes, the result had not answered his hopes. His mood, therefore, was far from benign, especially as he feared, that, owing to the declaration of peace, he would be forced to disgorge a part of his booty. Yet, accepting the Jesuits, he treated his captives with courtesy, and often amused himself with shooting larks on shore in company with Champlain. The Huguenots, however, of whom there were many in his ships, showed an exceeding bitterness against the Catholics. Chief among them was Michel, who had instigated and conducted the enterprise, the merchant admiral being but an indifferent seaman. Michel, whose skill was great, held a high command and the title of rear admiral. He was a man of a sensitive temperament, easily piqued on the point of honour. His morbid and irritable nerves were wrought to the pitch of frenzy by the reproaches of treachery and perfidy with which the French prisoners assailed him, while, on the other hand, he was in a state of continual rage at the fancied neglect and contumely of his English associates. He raved against Kirke, who, as he declared, treated him with an insupportable arrogance. "I have left my country," he exclaimed, "for the service of foreigners, and they give me nothing but ingratitude and scorn." His fevered mind, acting on his diseased body, often excited him to transports of fury, in which he cursed indiscriminately the people of St. Malo, against whom he had a grudge, and the Jesuits, whom he detested. On one occasion, Kirke was conversing with some of the latter. "Gentlemen," he said, "your business in Canada was to enjoy what belonged to Monsieur de Caen, whom you dispossessed." "Pardon me, sir," answered Brébeuf, "we came purely for the glory of God, and exposed ourselves to every kind of danger to convert the Indians." Here Michel broke in. "Ay, ay, convert the Indians; you mean convert the beaver." "That is false," retorted Brébeuf. Michel raised his fist, exclaiming, "But for the respect I owe the general, I would strike you for giving me the lie." Brébeuf, a man of powerful frame and vehement passions, nevertheless regained his practised self-command, and replied, "You must excuse me. I did not mean to give you the lie. I should be very sorry to do so. The words I used are those we use in the school when a doubtful question is advanced, and they mean no offence. Therefore I ask you to pardon me." Despite the apology, Michel's frenzied brain harped the presumed insult, and he raved about it without ceasing. "Bon Dieu!" said Champlain, "you swear well for a reformer." "I know it," returned Michel. "I should be content if I had but struck that Jesuit who gave me the lie before my general." At length, one of his transports of rage ended in a lethargy from which he never awoke. His funeral was conducted with pomp suited to his rank, and amid discharges of cannon whose dreary roar was echoed from the yawning gulf of the Saguenay, his body was borne to its rest under the rocks of Tadoussac. Good Catholics and good Frenchmen saw in his fate the immediate finger of Providence. "I do not doubt that his soul is in perdition," remarked Champlain, who, however, had endeavoured to befriend the unfortunate man during the excess of his frenzy. Having finished their carousings, which were profuse, and their trade with the Indians, which was not lucrative, the English steered down the St. Lawrence. Kirke feared greatly a meeting with Rosalie, a naval officer of distinction, who was to have sailed from France with a strong force to succour Quebec; but peace having been proclaimed, the expedition had been limited to 2 ships under Captain Daniel. Thus Kirke, wilfully ignoring the treaty of peace, Thus Kirke, wilfully ignoring the treaty of peace, was left to pursue his depredations unmolested. Daniel, however, thought too weak to cope with him, achieved a signal exploit. On the island of Cape Breton, near the site of Louisbourg, he found an English fort, built 2 months before, under the auspices, doubtless, of Sir William Alexander. Daniel, regarding it as a bold encroachment on French territory, stormed it at the head of his pikemen, entered sword in hand, and took it with all its defenders. Meanwhile, Kirke with his prisoners was crossing the Atlantic. His squadron at length reached Plymouth, whence Champlain set out for London. Here he had an interview with the French ambassador, who, at his instance, gained from the king a promise, that in pursuance of the terms of the treaty concluded the previous April, New France should be restored to the French crown. It long remained a mystery why Charles consented to a stipulation which pledged him to resign so important a conquest. The mystery is explained by the recent discovery of a letter from the king to Sir Isaac Wake, his ambassador at Paris. The promised dowry of Queen Henrietta Maria, amounting to 800,000 crowns, had been but half paid by the French government, and Charles, then at issue with his Parliament, and in desperate need of money, instructs his ambassador that, when he receives the balance due, and not before, he is to give up to the French both Quebec and Port Royal, which had also been captured by Kirke. The letter was accompanied by solemn instruments under our hand and seal, to make good the transfer on fulfilment of the condition. It was for a sum equal to about $240,000 that Charles entailed on Great Britain and her colonies a century of bloody wars. The Kirkes and their associates, who had made the conquest at their own cost, under the royal authority, were never reimbursed, though David Kirke received the honour of knighthood, which cost the king nothing. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Pioneers of France in the New World, Part 2, Champlain and His Associates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman. Part 2, Samuel Champlain and His Associates. Chapter 17, Death of Champlain, 1632 to 1635. On Monday, the 5th of July, 1632, Emery de Caen anchored before Quebec. He was commissioned by the French crown to reclaim the place from the English, to hold for 1 year a monopoly of the fur trade, as an indemnity for his losses in the war, and when this time had expired, to give the place to the 100 Associates of New France. By the Convention of Suza, New France was to be restored to the French crown. Yet it had been a matter of debate whether a fulfilment of this engagement was worth the demanding. That wilderness of woods and savages had been ruinous to nearly all connected with it. The Caens, successful at first, had suffered heavily in the end. The Associates were on the verge of bankruptcy. These deserts were useless unless peopled, and to people them would depopulate France. Thus argued the inexperienced reasoners of the time, judging from the wretched precedents of Spanish and Portuguese colonization. The world had not as yet the example of an island kingdom, which, vitalized by a stable and regulated liberty, has peopled a continent and spread colonies over all the earth, gaining constantly new vigour with the matchless growth of its offspring. On the other hand, honour, it was urged, demanded that France should be reinstated in the land which she had discovered and explored. Should she, the centre of civilization, remain cooped up within her own narrow limits, while rivals and enemies were sharing the vast regions of the West? The commerce and fisheries of New France would in time become a school for French sailors. Mines even now might be discovered, and the fur trade, well conducted, could not but be a source of wealth. Disbanded soldiers and women from the streets might be shipped to Canada. Thus New France would be peopled and Old France purified. A power more potent than reason reinforced such arguments. Richelieu seems to have regarded it as an act of personal encroachment that the subjects of a foreign crown should seize on the domain of a company of which he was the head, and it could not be supposed that, with power to eject them, the arrogant minister would suffer them to remain in undisturbed possession. A spirit far purer and more generous was active in the same behalf. The character of Champlain belonged rather to the Middle Age than to the 17th century. Long toil and endurance had calmed the adventurous enthusiasm of his youth into a steadfast earnestness of purpose, and he gave himself with a loyal zeal and devotedness to the profoundly mistaken principles which he had espoused. In his mind, patriotism and religion were inseparably linked. France was the champion of Christianity, and her honour, her greatness, were involved in her fidelity to this high function. Should she abandon to perdition the darkened nations among whom she had cast the first rays of hope? Among the members of the company were those who shared his zeal, and though its capital was exhausted, and many of the merchants were withdrawing in despair, these enthusiasts formed a subordinate association, raised a new fund, and embarked on the venture afresh. England then resigned her prize, and Caen was dispatched to reclaim Quebec from the reluctant hands of Thomas Kirke. The latter, obedient to an order from the King of England, struck his flag, embarked his followers, and abandoned the scene of his conquest. Caen landed with the Jesuits, Paul Le Jeune and Anne de la Noue. They climbed the steep stairway which led up the rock, and as they reached the top, the dilapidated fort lay on their left, while farther on was the stone cottage of the Heberts, surrounded with its vegetable gardens, the only thrifty spot amid a scene of neglect. But few Indians could be seen. True to their native instincts, they had, at first, left the defeated French and welcomed the conquerors. Their English partialities were, however, but short-lived. Their intrusion into houses and storerooms, the stench of their tobacco, and their importunate begging, though before borne patiently, were rewarded by the newcomers with oaths and sometimes with blows. The Indians soon shunned Quebec, seldom approaching it except when drawn by necessity or a craving for brandy. This was now the case, and several Algonquin families, maddened with drink, were howling, screeching, and fighting within their bark lodges. The women were frenzied like the men. It was dangerous to approach the place unarmed. In the following spring, 1633, on the 23rd of May, Champlain, commissioned anew by Richelieu, resumed command at Quebec in behalf of the company. Father Le Jeune, superior of the mission, was wakened from his morning sleep by the boom of the saluting cannon. Before he could sally forth, the convent door was darkened by the stately form of his brother Jesuit, Brebeuf, newly arrived, and the Indians who stood by uttered ejaculations of astonishment at the raptures of their greeting. The father hastened to the fort, and arrived in time to see a file of musketeers and pikemen mounting the pathway of the cliff below, and the heretic Caen resigning the keys of the citadel into the Catholic hands of Champlain. Le Jeune's delight exudes in praise of one not always a theme of Jesuit eulogy, but on whom, in the hope of a continuance of his favours, no praise could now be ill bestowed. I sometimes think that this great man, Richelieu, who by his admirable wisdom and matchless conduct of affairs is so renowned on earth, is preparing for himself a dazzling crown of glory in heaven, by the care he evinces for the conversion of so many lost infidel souls in this savage land. I pray affectionately for him every day, etc. For Champlain, too, he has praises which, if more measured, are at least as sincere. Indeed, the Father Superior had the best reason to be pleased with the temporal head of the colony. In his youth, Champlain had fought on the side of that more liberal and national form of Romanism of which the Jesuits were the most emphatic antagonists. Now, as Le Jeune tells us, with evident contentment, he chose him, the Jesuit, as director of his conscience. In truth, there were none but Jesuits to confess and absolve him, for the Recollets, prevented, to their deep chagrin, from returning to the missions they had founded, were seen no more in Canada, and the followers of Loyola were sole masters of the field. The manly heart of the commandant, earnest, zealous, and direct, was seldom chary of its confidence, or apt to stand too warily on its guard in presence of a profound art, mingled with a no less profound sincerity. A stranger visiting the fort of Quebec would have been astonished at its air of conventional decorum. Black Jesuits and scarfed officers mingled at Champlain's table. There was little conversation, but in its place histories and the lives of saints were read aloud, as in a monastic refectory. Prayers, masses, and confessions followed one another with an edifying regularity, and the bell of the adjacent chapel, built by Champlain, rang morning, noon, and night. Godless soldiers caught the infection, and whipped themselves in penance for their sins. Debauched artisans outdid each other in the fury of their contrition. Quebec was become a mission. Indians gathered thither as of old, not from the baneful lure of brandy, for the traffic in it was no longer tolerated, but from the less pernicious attraction of gifts, kind words, and politic blandishments. To the vital principle of propagandism both the commercial and the military character were subordinate, or, to speak more justly, trade, policy, and military power leaned on the missions as their main support, the grand instrument of their extension. The missions were to explore the interior, the missions were to win over the savage hordes at once to heaven and to France. Peaceful, benign, beneficent, were the weapons of this conquest. France aimed to subdue, not by the sword but by the cross, not to overwhelm and crush the nations she invaded, but to convert, civilize, and embrace them among her children. And who were the instruments and the promoters of this proselytism, at once so devout and so politic? Who can answer? Who can trace out the crossing and mingling currents of wisdom and folly, ignorance and knowledge, truth and falsehood, weakness and force, the noble and the base, can analyze a systematized contradiction, and follow through its sacred wheels, springs, and levers a phenomenon of moral mechanism? Who can define the Jesuits? The story of their missions is marvellous as a tale of chivalry, or legends of the lives of saints. For many years it was the history of New France and of the wild communities of her desert empire. 2 years passed. The mission of the Hurons was established, and here the indomitable Brebeuf, with a band worthy of him, toiled amid miseries and perils as fearful as ever shook the constancy of man, while Champlain at Quebec, in a life uneventful, yet harassing and laborious, was busied in the round of cares which his post involved. Christmas Day 1635 was a dark day in the annals of New France. In a chamber of the fort, breathless and cold, lay the hardy frame which war, the wilderness, and the sea had buffeted so long in vain. After 2 months and a half of illness, Champlain, stricken with paralysis, at the age of 68, was dead. His last cares were for his colony, and the succour of its suffering families. Jesuits, officers, soldiers, traders, and the few settlers of Quebec followed his remains to the church. Le Jeune pronounced his eulogy, and the feeble community built a tomb to his honour. The colony could ill spare him. For 27 years he had laboured hard and ceaselessly for its welfare, sacrificing fortune, repose, and domestic peace to a cause embraced with enthusiasm and pursued with intrepid persistency. His character belonged partly to the past, partly to the present. The Preux chevalier, the crusader, the romance-loving explorer, the curious, knowledge-seeking traveller, the practical navigator, all claimed their share in him. His views, though far beyond those of the mean spirits around him, belonged to his age and his creed. He was less statesman than soldier. He leaned to the most direct and boldest policy, and one of his last acts was to petition Richelieu for men and munitions for repressing that standing menace to the colony, the Iroquois. His dauntless courage was matched by an unwearied patience, proved by lifelong vexations, and not wholly subdued even by the saintly follies of his wife. He is charged with credulity, from which few of his age were free, and which in all ages has been the foible of earnest and generous natures, too ardent to criticize and too honourable to doubt the honour of others. Perhaps the heretic might have liked him more if the Jesuits had liked him less. The adventurous explorer of Lake Huron, the bold invader of the Iroquois, befits but indifferently the monastic sobrieties of the fort of Quebec, and his sombre environment of priests. Yet Champlain was no formalist, nor was his an empty zeal. A soldier from his youth, in an age of unbridled license, his life had answered to his maxims, and when a generation had passed after his visit to the Hurons, their elders remembered with astonishment the continence of the great French war chief. His books marked the man, all for his theme and his purpose, nothing for himself. Crude in style, full of the superficial errors of carelessness and haste, rarely diffuse, often brief to a fault, they bear on every page the palpable impress of truth. With the life of the faithful soldier closes the opening period of New France. Heroes of another stamp succeed, and it remains to tell the story of their devoted lives, their faults, follies, and virtues. End of chapter 17. End of Pioneers of France in the New World by Francis Parkman.